He didn't even look at her when he left the room. That was the part that stayed with Celeste long after everything else. Not the sound of Vivian's laughter seeping under the office door, not the cold marble beneath her bare feet, not even the weight of $37,000 of hand-stitched silk pooling around her ankles like something already dead. It was the fact that Damien had walked past her in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, eyes cutting straight through her as if she were a lamp, a piece of furniture, something decorative and easily moved. She had been his wife for 4 hours and 11 minutes, and she had already stopped existing to him. If that had happened to you, if the person who swore before everyone you knew that they would love you had looked through you like glass, what would you have done? Would you have cried? Would you have screamed? Would you have called your mother, your best friend, anyone? Celeste did none of those things. She stood very still in that hallway and she listened, and then she made a phone call that would take 11 months to detonate. And when it finally did, there would be nothing left of Damien Moretti's world but smoke and the faint smell of his own arrogance burning. If this story already has your pulse running, stay with me, because what Celeste does next will make your jaw drop. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single chapter of this story, and hit that like button right now. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Some of you are watching from places I've never even dreamed of, and that means everything to me. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The wedding had cost $4.2 million. Celeste knew this not because she cared, but because she had reviewed every invoice herself 3 weeks before the ceremony. That was how she operated, quietly, thoroughly, without calling attention to the fact that she had reviewed anything at all. The florist from Milan, the pastry architect flown in from Lyon, the string quartet that had once performed at a former president's inauguration, the security detail that wore tuxedos and earpieces simultaneously. Every line item, every vendor contract, every catering agreement had passed through her hands at some point. Not because Damien asked, he never asked. He simply signed things when she placed them in front of him and went back to whatever he was doing. He thought he was the one running things. That had always been the arrangement. Celeste sat at the vanity in the bridal suite at 6:47 in the morning, 3 hours before the ceremony, and stared at her own face in the mirror. Her hair and makeup team wouldn't arrive for another hour. She had sent her assistant out for coffee. She wanted this one sliver of quiet before the performance began. She was 34 years old. She had dark eyes that people often described as unreadable, which she had learned early in life to cultivate deliberately. Her grandmother had told her once that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was let people see exactly what she was thinking, and Celeste had taken that piece of advice and built an entire personality around it. She was composed. She was precise. She laughed at the right moments and said the right things and wore the right expressions, and she had been doing it for so long that she occasionally wondered whether there was anything left underneath that wasn't performance. She touched the edge of her jaw, pressed 2 fingers just below her ear the way she always did when she was working something out. Today, she was marrying Damien Moretti. She had known Damien for 6 years. They had met at a business function in Chicago that she had attended on behalf of her grandfather's estate, a function she almost hadn't gone to because she had a sinus infection and her head was full of cotton. She remembered standing near a window with a glass of sparkling water, watching the room with the detached patience of someone doing reconnaissance, and Damien had materialized beside her like something inevitable. He was handsome in a way that was almost inconvenient. That had been her first thought. Broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been designed specifically to make women stop concentrating on things that mattered. He had a smile that arrived a half-second after his eyes, which gave it the appearance of sincerity without actually being sincere. She had noticed that immediately. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he'd said. "I look like I'm thinking," she'd said. "People confuse the two." He'd laughed. She'd let him. What followed was 6 years of careful navigation. She had understood from the beginning what Damien was: ambitious, magnetic, fundamentally incapable of seeing the world as anything other than a landscape of assets to acquire. She was not naive about him. She had never been naive about him. The question she had wrestled with over and over through those 6 years of late dinners and offshore board meetings, and a relationship that existed somewhere between business partnership and emotional dependency, was whether she could live with what he was. She had eventually decided she could. That had been her first real mistake. Not because she loved him too much. If anything, the problem was that she didn't love him the right way. She loved him the way you love a complicated equation, always working to solve it, never quite getting there. She wanted to understand him more than she wanted to be with him, and she had confused those two things for long enough that by the time the engagement ring appeared, she had stopped examining the difference. The ring had appeared on a Tuesday, of all days. Not a special dinner, not a weekend trip to somewhere meaningful. A Tuesday. He'd dropped it onto the kitchen island while she was reviewing a shipping contract, a small black velvet box that landed with a soft sound, and he'd said, "I think we should just do it," like they were deciding on a restaurant. She had looked at the box for a long moment. Then she'd said, "Okay." That should have told her something. The morning of the wedding, sitting at the vanity with her coffee and her quiet and her careful face, she pressed her fingers under her jaw and told herself what she always told herself when doubt started to collect in the corners of her mind. She was prepared. Whatever happened, she was prepared. Her grandfather had not spent 15 years teaching her to think 3 moves ahead so she could spend her wedding morning in a panic. She picked up her coffee cup. Her hand was steady. She was always, always steady. The ceremony was flawless, the way terrible things often are. 500 guests packed into the ballroom of a private estate north of Chicago, a venue that Celeste had selected from a short list of 8 after evaluating not just the aesthetics but the logistics, the catering kitchen capacity, the security access points, the vehicular flow pattern in the event of an emergency. She had chosen it for the sightlines. You could see every entrance from the altar. Old habits. She walked down the aisle on the arm of her cousin Marco, who was the closest thing she had to family since her grandfather died 8 months earlier. Marco was 42 and nervous and smelled faintly of the cigarette he'd snuck outside 20 minutes before, and he held her arm the way men hold things they're afraid of dropping. She squeezed his hand once to tell him it was fine. It was not fine, but she would deal with that later. Damien was waiting at the altar. He was wearing a suit that had been fitted 3 times and still sat slightly wrong across the left shoulder. She noticed that the moment she reached him. He was watching her approach with an expression she had spent 6 years studying, and for the first time since she'd known him, she couldn't read it. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She was good at reading him. She prided herself on it. "You look," he started when she reached him. "I know," she said quietly. The corner of his mouth moved. Modest. Accurate. That earned a real laugh, small and genuine, and for a fraction of a second she felt something loosen in her chest, something that reminded her why she had said okay on a Tuesday when a box landed on her kitchen island. He could do that. He could make something in her actually relax, even when everything else in the room was tension. The vows were traditional. She had requested traditional. He'd agreed without argument, which meant he hadn't cared either way, which meant he'd been thinking about something else during the conversation when they'd discussed it. She'd noticed that too, filed it away. When the officiant pronounced them married and Damien kissed her, it lasted 3 seconds. She counted. Then he pulled back and his eyes were already moving to the room, checking the faces of the guests, the response, the performance of the thing. And she understood in that instant that the ceremony had not been about her at all. It had been an announcement. She kept her expression exactly where it needed to be and turned to face the room and smiled, and 500 people applauded, and somewhere in the crowd she caught Gideon Hale watching her from the left side of the 3rd row. He was 61 years old, gray at the temples, with the bearing of a man who had spent decades being the quietest person in loud rooms. He had been her grandfather's closest advisor for 30 years, and was now, in the absence of anyone else, hers. He did not applaud. He simply watched her. She held his gaze for 1 second, and then she looked away. The reception ran 7 hours. Celeste danced. She made conversation. She laughed at the right moments. She touched Damien's arm at socially appropriate intervals and refilled her champagne glass twice and actually drank neither. She ate 4 bites of the appetizer and nothing of the main course because her stomach had decided sometime around the cocktail hour that it was done cooperating. She watched Damien work the room. That was what he did at events. He worked them, the way a fisherman works a river, moving from one current to the next with practiced ease. He had a gift for making every person he spoke to feel temporarily significant, which was useful in a business where loyalty was purchased in increments. She watched him clap backs and lean into conversations and hold eye contact for exactly long enough. He was good at it. She had always acknowledged that. She also watched Vivian cross. Vivian had been Damien's executive secretary for 3 years. She was 31, impeccably presented, with a talent for anticipating what Damien needed before he knew he needed it. Celeste had watched her from the beginning the way she watched most people who entered Damien's orbit, with careful neutrality, cataloging details, waiting to understand what exactly the person was. Vivian was efficient. Vivian was intelligent. Vivian laughed at things Damien said even when they weren't particularly funny. Celeste had noted all of this. She had chosen, for reasons that felt complicated at the time, not to act on any of it. At the reception, Vivian wore deep burgundy, appropriate for a professional event. She stayed on the periphery of the room, which was correct behavior for an employee at an employer's wedding. But 3 times over the course of the evening, Celeste watched Vivian's eyes find Damien across the room with the specific, unguarded hunger of a person who has forgotten they're being watched. Celeste was always watching. She simply preferred that people not know it. At 11:40, Damien's phone vibrated. She saw it, felt it, almost, the way you feel a temperature change in a room. His hand moved to his inside jacket pocket, and something in his posture shifted by 2 or 3 degrees, subtle, the way a compass needle shifts. He excused himself from a conversation with the head of a Chicago investment firm and moved toward the edge of the room. Celeste counted to 60. Then she set down her champagne glass and followed. The private corridor that connected the ballroom to the estate's residential wing was lined with oil paintings that someone had selected for their obvious expense rather than their meaning. Celeste moved through it without touching anything, her heels silent on the runner because she had walked these floors during the venue walkthrough, and she knew where the boards didn't creak. She could hear voices before she reached the office. Not clearly, not through the solid door, just the shape of them, the cadence. She knew Damien's voice the way she knew her own heartbeat, instinctive, involuntary. But the other voice was lighter, and it was laughing, and something in the laugh was private, intimate, the sound of someone not performing. She stood outside the door. She had 2 choices, and she knew it. She had always known this moment was somewhere ahead of her, in some form, and she stood very still on the opposite side of the door and listened. She could not hear the words. She could hear enough. The laugh came again. Damien said something low and the laugh responded, shaped like yes, shaped like finally, shaped like every syllable of a conversation that had been happening for a long time in rooms Celeste had never entered. She put her hand on the door, flat, palm pressed to the wood, without pushing. She stood there for somewhere between 30 seconds and 100 years. Her dress weighed 40 pounds. It felt like that, all of a sudden, every yard of silk pulling her toward the floor. Her heart was doing something technical and unpleasant in her chest. She noticed that with some detached part of her brain, the way you'd notice weather. Then she lifted her hand off the door. She turned around and walked back down the corridor without making a sound.
Yes.
She went to the bridal suite, not because she needed to cry. She wasn't crying. She was not certain she was going to cry at all, and found that more disturbing than the alternative. She went to the bridal suite because it was the only place in the building that was entirely hers, that had her things in it, and she needed to be somewhere with her things. She sat on the edge of the bed in $37,000 of silk and looked at her own hands. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She sat there for 9 minutes. She tracked the time on the small clock on the nightstand, and she worked through what she knew with the same methodical calm she applied to financial reviews and security assessments and every other situation in her life that required clear thinking over emotional reaction. Here were the facts. Damien had received a phone call at his own wedding reception and left to take it somewhere private. The private somewhere contained Vivian Cross. The quality of the sounds she had heard through the door, the register of the conversation, the specific texture of that laughter, was not professional, was not accidental, was not new. Here were the implications. The marriage had been calculated. Her position in Damien's life was already being superseded by someone else's. Whatever he had built toward her over 6 years, whatever had looked, in certain lights and on certain Tuesday afternoons, like something genuine, it had been functional. She was useful. She was connected. She was apparently now complete. Here were her options. She could confront him tonight and watch him manage it. Watch him produce explanations with the same smooth efficiency he brought to everything else. Make her feel uncertain about her own ears, her own judgment. She could leave and let him frame the narrative. She could wait and be replaced in slow motion while pretending not to see it. Or she could reach into the nightstand drawer where she had placed a single item 3 days before the wedding against a contingency she had hoped would remain theoretical. She reached into the drawer. She pulled out a phone, not her personal phone, not any phone registered to her name or her carrier or her household. A clean phone, prepaid, purchased 6 weeks ago by a person she trusted with a number of things, none of which were small. She looked at it for a moment. Then she dialed. It rang twice. "I need you to begin," she said when the line connected. A pause. She could hear Gideon exhale. Not in surprise, just the slow release of a man settling into something he'd been prepared for. Timeline? Immediate. She looked at the clock on the nightstand. "He'll notice something by morning. I want him to." "Understood." A pause. "Celeste?" "Yes." "Are you all right?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm steady," she said, and hung up. She stood at the window of the bridal suite for a long time after that, still in the dress, watching the lights of the estate below. The reception was still running. She could hear the music, faint and muffled, filtering up through the floor. People were still dancing, still celebrating, still inside the version of tonight that Damien had built for an audience. She had stopped existing inside that version approximately 47 minutes ago. She reached behind herself, unhooked the first 14 buttons of the gown herself. Her maid of honor had already gone home. And when she ran out of reach, she went to the desk and used the letter opener to slip the last 3 fastenings without tearing the fabric. She stepped out of the dress carefully, laid it across the chair. It looked empty, like the outline of something. She pulled on the clothes she had left in the closet 3 days earlier. Dark slacks, a simple blouse, flat shoes, the clothes she thought in. Then she opened her personal laptop, sat down at the desk in her wedding night clothes, and began to work. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. Not because she was doing the work herself, she wasn't, not most of it, but she was the one who needed to authorize each piece of it, who needed to move through the architecture of what she had built, quietly, across 8 years of careful construction, and confirm that every lock would turn when she turned it. Her grandfather, Enzo Carrara, had died 8 months ago at the age of 83 of a stroke that took him in the garden of his home while he was deadheading roses. He had been a man of extraordinary methodical patience, the kind of man who played the long game so naturally that he sometimes forgot to explain what game he was playing. He had built an empire that existed in 3 layers: the visible layer, which was the legitimate businesses; the operating layer, which was the network that sustained everything; and the foundation, which was what he had left to Celeste. Not in his will, not anywhere a lawyer would look. In a series of trusts, transfers, and succession agreements drawn up over 27 years that had quietly moved ownership of nearly everything that mattered into Celeste's name before his death. He had not done it because he distrusted Damien specifically. He had done it because he had distrusted the concept of Damien, the kind of man who leads with charm and assumes acquisition. He had been precise about this. He had also been right. Celeste moved through the accounts in the order she had memorized. The Chicago operating account, frozen, pending review. The international transfer networks, suspended, verification required. The property management holding company, access revoked pending board resolution. The private security contracts, flagged for compliance audit. She was not doing any of this herself. The authorizations were going through Gideon, and Gideon had spent 30 years executing things quietly and well. But she was the one confirming each action, watching each piece fall into place with the soundless precision of something that had been built to do exactly this. At 3:47 in the morning, she heard Damien's footsteps in the corridor outside the suite. She did not close the laptop. She did not change her expression. She turned her chair 45 degrees toward the door and waited. The handle turned. Damien came in and saw her sitting there in the dark clothes at the desk, laptop open, and something moved across his face. Surprise, calculation, the rapid recalibration of a man who had expected something else. "You're still up," he said. "I was working," she said. He looked at the dress over the chair, at her clothes. at the laptop screen, which showed nothing that would mean anything to him. "It's 4 in the morning. I'm aware." He crossed the room slowly, the way he moved when he was managing a situation he didn't fully understand. "Celeste." He said her name the way he always said it when he wanted something from her. Soft, specific, a key into a lock. "I'm sorry about earlier. The call was—" "I don't need an explanation," she said. He stopped. "You're not—" "I'm tired," she said. Which was true. "We can talk tomorrow." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on the nightstand was the only light in the room, and it made his face harder to read than usual, all shadow and insufficient warmth. She watched him decide not to push it. She watched him file whatever he'd seen in this room under manageable and conclude that she was simply tired and emotional and would be better addressed in the morning. He was wrong about every single word in that sentence. "Come to bed," he said. "In a moment," she said. He went to bed. She turned back to the laptop. She sat at that desk for another 2 hours, and when she finally stopped, the sky outside was beginning to pale at the edges, and she had confirmed every piece of what needed to be confirmed. And Damian Moretti was sleeping 8 feet away and had no idea that the world he was going to wake up to had already fundamentally changed. She closed the laptop. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the gray beginning of morning through the window. Her grandfather had told her once, when she was 19 and furious about something she could no longer remember, that the most powerful move a person can make is the one no one sees coming. Not because it's hidden, but because no one believed you were the kind of person who would make it. She had spent her entire adult life being underestimated. She had always known it would matter eventually. She reached up and pressed 2 fingers just below her jaw. Her pulse was steady. It was always, always steady. She sat there until the sun came up, and then she went to wash her face, and when Damian's phone started ringing at 7:13 in the morning with a call from his chief financial officer, she was already dressed and sitting in the chair by the window with her coffee, watching the light change over the city that was about to change completely. She did not look at him when he answered. She simply watched the light. And she waited. Damian's voice hit a register she hadn't heard before. Not loud. He wasn't a man who shouted when he was frightened. He went the other direction, quieter, compressed, like an engine pulling too hard against a seized gear. She heard it from the chair by the window, the coffee cup still warm between her palms, and she did not turn around. "Say that again," he said into the phone. A pause. She could hear the tiny voice on the other end. His CFO, Raymond Chu, a compact and perpetually anxious man who had served the Moretti financial operation for 11 years and who was, at 7:13 on a Wednesday morning, clearly delivering news that was making his voice climb. "That's not possible," Damian said. Another pause. "Raymond." His voice dropped further. "That account has been active for 6 years. What do you mean access is suspended?" Celeste lifted her coffee, drank slowly. The light over the city was thin and gray, the kind of early morning light that showed you what things actually looked like before they had a chance to compose themselves for the day. "Get Hargrove on the phone," Damian said. Get him on right now, and pull up the Singapore transfers, all of them, going back to January." A pause. I don't care if it's 4 in the morning there. Wake him up." He hung up. She heard him stand, heard the particular sound his shoes made against the floor when he was pacing. 3 steps, turn, 3 steps, turn. A habit she had catalogued years ago without meaning to. "Something wrong?" she said. She kept her eyes on the window. "Business," he said, tight, controlled. "Go back to sleep." "I've been awake," she said. He didn't answer that. She heard him pick up his jacket from the chair where he'd left it, heard the door open, heard it close without a slam, which meant he was managing himself, which meant he was more frightened than he was letting on, because Damian only managed himself when he was genuinely unsettled. She took another sip of coffee. It had taken less than 7 hours. She had expected 12. By 9 in the morning, the suite had received 4 separate calls on the landline, which nobody used except people who had been told not to use a cell. She answered none of them. She ordered breakfast from the estate kitchen, eggs, toast, fruit, the kind of meal that communicated normalcy, and ate most of it standing at the window because she was too restless to sit. At 9:40, Gideon texted her from the clean number. Chicago account confirmed frozen. Singapore flagged by compliance. Luxembourg trust in review. Hargrove has been unreachable since 6 a.m. She read it twice, put the phone face down on the nightstand. At 10:15, Damien came back. He came through the door faster than he'd left, and he was different. Something in the jaw, something in the way he was holding his hands, and she recognized the look. It was the look of a man who had been moving through a building expecting walls and found air instead. He was recalibrating in real time, and he wasn't good at hiding it when he was doing it fast. "I need to ask you something," he said. She set down her coffee cup. "All right." "The Carrara accounts." He stopped in the middle of the room. "The ones your grandfather transferred before he died. Where are they held?" She looked at him steadily. "That's a strange question for our wedding morning." "Celeste." He said her name like it was a handle he was gripping. "I have 3 accounts frozen, 2 international partners who stopped returning calls overnight, and my head of compliance is telling me there's a succession dispute flagged on 6 separate holding entities. A succession dispute. On entities that were settled 8 months ago." "Succession disputes can be reopened," she said, "if new documentation surfaces." Something shifted in his face. "New documentation." "It happens," she said. He was looking at her the way he looked at contract language he suspected was trying to trap him. She let him look. She had spent 6 years being looked at like that, and she had learned to hold very still and let the look run out of momentum on its own. "Are you telling me you know something about this?" he said. "I'm telling you that estate law is complicated," she said, "and that you should probably call your attorney instead of standing in a hotel suite interrogating your wife on the morning after your wedding." The word wife landed oddly. She watched it land. "Something is wrong," he said. "Something is specifically wrong, and it started last night, and I need you to tell me if you know what it is." "Damien." She picked up her coffee cup again. "I don't run your financial operations. That's Raymond's job." He stared at her for a long moment. Then his phone went off again. 3 rapid vibrations, the pattern she recognized as his security chief. And he looked at it, and looked at her and made a choice that told her everything. He chose the phone. He walked out. She listened to the door close. Then she sat down, finally, in the chair, and let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest since sometime around 3 in the morning. She checked out of the estate at noon. Not dramatically. She didn't need drama. Drama was for people who needed other people to understand what was happening. She simply had her bags brought down, settled the remaining incidentals on the account she controlled, and called a car. The wedding suite had been booked through Friday. She left 2 days early and told no one in advance. Marco was waiting at the car. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was accurate. She'd called him at 6 in the morning and told him to be there at noon without explaining why. Because Marco was the kind of person who showed up when you told him to and saved his questions for later. That was why she trusted him. He took one look at her face when she came through the door and said nothing. Just took the bag from her hand and put it in the trunk. They drove for 20 minutes before he said, "How bad?" "It started," she said. He exhaled through his nose. "Okay." A pause. "Does he know it's you?" "He suspects something. He doesn't know what or how much." She looked out the window. The city was fully awake now, ordinary and indifferent, people moving through their ordinary days. He's going to start pulling threads. When he does, he'll find some of them are already cut. And Gideon? Gideon has everything he needs. She pressed her fingers under her jaw, steady. "I need you to go to the house on Meridian and pick up the secondary drives from the study. Don't call ahead. Don't tell anyone you're going." Marco glanced at her in the rear view. "The study's locked." "I know," she said. "The key is in the blue book on the 3rd shelf. The actual blue book, not the safe behind it. My grandfather hid things in the most obvious places because he said people always look behind the obvious thing." Marco almost smiled. "Sounds like him." "It was him," she said. And then she looked back out the window and didn't say anything else for a long time. The office Gideon used was not the kind of office that appeared in directories. It was on the 14th floor of a building in the West Loop that nominally housed an insurance consulting firm, staffed by 3 people who processed actual insurance documents and 4 people who processed other things entirely. Gideon had worked from this space for 19 years. It smelled like printer ink and cold coffee and the faint chemical residue of documents that had been fed through shredders recently. He was standing at the window when she arrived, which meant he'd seen her car. He didn't turn around immediately. "Raymond Chu resigned this morning," he said. She stopped in the doorway. Already? Sent the letter at 8:42, hand-delivered to Damien's assistant. He turned. He looked tired in the way that older men who didn't sleep enough looked tired. Not haggard, just worn thin at the edges. He cited personal reasons. He has a lawyer. Raymond has always had a lawyer, she said. Which lawyer? A firm in New York, corporate defense. He picked up a folder from his desk and handed it to her. They were retained 3 weeks ago. She opened the folder, looked at the first page, read the case number at the top and the retention date and the names of the partners. He was already preparing. He knew something was coming, Gideon said. The question is whether he knew because he was watching Damien or because someone told him to watch. She looked up. You think Raymond is connected to this? I think Raymond has worked for Damien for 11 years and suddenly has a New York defense firm on retainer 3 weeks before Damien's accounts start freezing. He took the folder back. I think coincidences in this business cost more than most people can afford. She sat down in his chair across from his desk, the one that had been there since her grandfather sat in it, the one Gideon had never replaced because he was sentimental in ways he would never admit to. What else? It wasn't a question. He understood that. He opened his laptop and turned it toward her. On the screen was a financial flowchart, the kind that required 3 monitors to display properly, compressed here into something that still made her eyes work. She leaned forward. These are the shell transfers I've been tracking for the past 6 weeks, he said. He pointed to a cluster of entities on the left side. These are Moretti operating companies, all legitimate, all established, all properly registered. Standard revenue flows. Nothing unusual. His finger moved right. These are the same companies 6 months ago. Look at the volume differential. She looked. The numbers were wrong. Not wrong the way accounting errors are wrong the way deliberate construction is wrong. The specific wrongness of something designed to look right from a distance and collapse under close examination. How much? She said. Confirmed? 11 million. Estimated if the pattern holds through the entities I haven't fully traced yet? He paused. Somewhere between 30 and 40. The room was quiet for a moment. Siphoned where? She said. He leaned over and tapped a series of nodes on the right side of the chart. She read the names. 2 of them she didn't recognize. One of them she did, from a long time ago, from a conversation in her grandfather's study that she had not been supposed to hear. Viscari, she said. Gideon nodded once. Roman Viscari's operation. She sat back. Damien has been moving money to Roman Viscari. Not Damien, Gideon said carefully. The money isn't moving in ways Damien would authorize. The signature structures are his, technically, his authorization codes, his approval sequences. But the timing patterns don't match his usual operational rhythm. Damien approves things in batches, on Thursdays. These transfers are going through on Tuesdays and Fridays, in increments specifically sized to stay below the reporting threshold. She understood immediately. Someone with access to his authorization credentials. Someone inside his operation who has been doing this carefully enough that it didn't register as unusual in any single month, but across 14 months the pattern is unmistakable. He closed the laptop. Someone very good at this. She looked at him. He looked back. Vivian Cross has been with his operation for 3 years, she said. Yes, he said. She has access to his systems. Broad access, he said. She manages his calendar, his correspondence, his executive approvals. In practical terms, on any given day, there is very little operational difference between what Damien can authorize and what Vivian can authorize on his behalf. Celeste was quiet. Outside the window, 14 floors down, the city moved at its ordinary pace. She could see a delivery truck double-parked and a woman arguing with her umbrella in the wind, and a man eating a sandwich on the steps of the building across the street with the focused peace of someone who had absolutely no idea anything in the world was wrong. She's not just his mistress, Celeste said. No, Gideon said. I don't think she ever was. She drove to the Moretti townhouse at 2 in the afternoon. Not because Damien was there, she knew he wasn't. She had Gideon's contact tracking his vehicle, and he was at his attorney's office in the Loop, which was exactly where she expected him to be. She went because there were things in that house that she needed, and because the staff there still recognized her authority, and because she had made the decision sometime around 4 in the morning that she was not going to wait to be acted upon. The housekeeper, Elena, met her at the door with the particular expression of a woman who had been in the employment of powerful people long enough to understand that she should not ask questions. "Mrs. Moretti," she said. "Elena." Celeste stepped inside. The house was quiet in the way that large, expensive houses are quiet when only the people who maintain them are present. A kind of active silence, things being cleaned and ordered and maintained in the background. "Is anyone else here?" "Mr. Moretti's assistant called to say he'd be out until this evening," Elena said carefully. "His assistant," Celeste repeated. "Vivian?" "Yes, ma'am." Celeste nodded. "I need access to the home office, the lower drawer of the secondary desk. My husband mentioned there were some documents there related to the Carrara estate transition that I need to review." Elena moved without hesitation. Elena had been moving without hesitation in this house for 12 years and understood that her job required exactly that, and led her down the hall to the room that Damien used as his home office. It was a room she had been in many times. She knew every surface of it. She knew also that the secondary desk's lower drawer required a key that Damien kept on a chain with his car keys, which he would have with him. What she needed was not in that drawer. It was, as her grandfather would have appreciated, in the most obvious place possible. The middle shelf of the bookcase on the east wall, wedged behind a copy of a tax reference manual that had not been moved in 4 years, which she knew because the dust line was 4 years old. She waited until Elena stepped out to answer a knock at the front door. Then she crossed to the bookcase, pulled out the tax manual, and retrieved the thin manila envelope behind it in one motion. She put it in her bag, put the manual back, was standing in the center of the room examining a painting when Elena returned. "Found what you needed?" Elena asked. "It was misfiled," Celeste said, easily overlooked. She was in the car, 3 blocks from the townhouse, when her phone rang. Not the clean phone, her personal phone. The name on the screen was one she hadn't expected, Adrian Moretti, Damien's younger brother. She looked at the name for 3 full rings. Adrian was 30 years old and had the particular combination of charm and instability that sometimes ran in families where ambition exceeded good sense by a significant margin. He had always been pleasant to her face, and she had always trusted him approximately as far as she could conveniently project him. She answered. "Adrian," she said, "Celeste." His voice was warm, doing a specific kind of work that warmth sometimes does. "How are you?" "I heard you left the estate this morning." "News travels," she said. "In this family it does." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I've been trying to reach Damien, and he's not picking up." "He's with his attorney," she said. Silence. Brief, but loaded. "His attorney. Is everything all right? With the 2 of you?" She watched the city move past the car window. "Why do you ask?" "Because I care about my brother," he said, "and about you. Your family now." The word family in his mouth was soft and deliberate, and she heard the deliberateness of it, the way she heard most things people didn't know they were revealing. "That's kind," she said. "I'll let Damien know you called." "Celeste, wait. I'll let him know," she said, and hung up. She looked at the phone for a moment after the call ended. Then she dialed Gideon. "Adrian just called me," she said when he picked up. A pause. "What did he want?" "He wanted to know if everything was all right between Damien and me," she said. "He was fishing." "For what?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But he called me before he'd tried Damien more than twice. Before anyone would reasonably expect to call a new bride on the morning after her wedding to ask how things were going." She looked out the window. He knew something was wrong before it should have been visible. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I'll pull his financial records," he said. "Do that," she said. "And Gideon," she paused. "Start looking at him the way you looked at Vivian." She met Damien at 7 that evening. Not at the townhouse, neutral ground, which was his suggestion through his attorney's office, which told her the attorney had advised him to treat this as a negotiation rather than a marital disagreement, which told her that the attorney already understood the scope of what was happening. They met at a restaurant Damien owned, a private room in the back, the kind of room where important things were said and not recorded. She arrived first and sat with her back to the wall, which was habit, and ordered water and nothing else. He came in at 7:12. He had changed since this morning, fresh suit, composed face, But something underneath hadn't changed, something in the quality of his stillness. He was working very hard at appearing in control, and the effort showed, just slightly, in the set of his jaw. He sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I need you to explain something to me," he said. "All right," she said. "6 of my accounts are frozen or flagged. 2 international partners have suspended contact. My CFO resigned this morning." He kept his voice even. "My attorney tells me there are documents on file, new documents filed in the last 48 hours, that challenge the ownership structure of 14 business entities that were settled in your grandfather's estate transfer." "That's a lot," she said. His jaw tightened, just barely. "Celeste." "I'm listening," she said. "Did you do this?" The question sat between them on the table like something neither of them wanted to touch first. She looked at him. He was a handsome man. He was a man who had made her laugh on 100 different evenings, who had put his hand at the small of her back in rooms full of people, and made her feel, briefly, that she was something he was proud of. She had not been wrong about all of him. She had simply been wrong about enough of him. "I think," she said slowly, "that you should be asking your executive secretary where $40 million went." The stillness in him cracked. Small. A hairline fracture, nothing dramatic. But she saw it. "What are you talking about?" he said. Flat. The question stripped of its inflection. "I'm talking about 14 months of transfers from your operating accounts to shell entities connected to Roman Viscari's organization." She kept her voice level. "I'm talking about authorization patterns that use your credentials but not your calendar. I'm talking about someone who has been very carefully moving money out of the Moretti operation while standing close enough to you that nobody was looking at her." He was very still. "That's not," he started. "I have the documentation," she said. "Gideon has been tracing it for 6 weeks." "Gideon." He said the name like it was a piece of evidence. "Gideon Hale has been running an investigation into my operation. Gideon Hale has been protecting the assets he helped my grandfather build for 30 years, she said, "which is what he's paid to do." Damien stood up. Not dramatically. He pushed back his chair and stood, the way people stand when they need to be vertical, because sitting feels like seating something. He turned partly away, hand going to his jaw, working through something behind his eyes. She waited. "You're telling me Vivian is stealing from me," he said. Not a question. Something worse. Something that sounded like a man putting a building block down in a place he hadn't expected. "I'm telling you that someone with access to your systems has been stealing from you," she said, "and that the documentation for that theft is sitting in my attorney's office, and that it includes enough detail to make a very compelling case in front of the family council that the Moretti operation has been compromised from within." He turned back to look at her. "The family council." "The 12 ruling families," she said. "Yes." "You're not going to the family council." His voice had gone to a different place. Not louder, just denser. "Not yet," she said. "I'm talking to you first." She picked up her water glass. "Because whatever else is true, you were my husband yesterday. That deserves a conversation." Something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely classify. She filed it without resolving it. "What do you want?" he said. "I want the truth," she said. "All of it, starting with Vivian, and where it started, and what you knew and what you didn't." She set the glass down. "Because right now I'm looking at a picture that has her at the center of it, but pictures can be composed to show you what someone wants you to see. I've been in this business long enough to know that." He sat back down, slowly. 3 years ago, he said. Then he stopped, started again. "I didn't know about Viscari. I need you to understand that." "I'm not sure what I understand yet," she said. "Keep going." And he did. For the next 40 minutes, Damien Moretti told her things she already half knew and things she hadn't known at all. And one thing, toward the end, almost reluctantly, almost as if he was aware of how it would land, that made her set down her water glass and look at him with a quality of attention she reserved for genuinely surprising information. He told her that 3 weeks ago, Adrian had come to him privately and suggested, carefully, plausibly, with documentation she now understood was fabricated, that Celeste's grandfather had structured the estate transfer fraudulently, that Celeste had been acting as a hidden owner for years, that she was, in effect, a threat to the operation, that Adrian had recommended, as a solution, that Damien cement his authority by taking control of the estate assets immediately after the wedding, before Celeste could act on whatever plan she was running. Damien had not told her this. He had instead, 3 weeks ago, quietly begun the process of retaining a legal team to challenge the estate structure. She sat with this for a long moment. "You were already moving against me," she said. He met her eyes, and she recognized something in his expression she had never seen there before. Something that looked, in the bad lighting of this private room, like actual shame. "I didn't know who to believe," he said. "You believed your brother over your own judgment," she said. You believed the person who told you what you wanted to hear," she said, "which was that the threat was outside you, that it was me." She looked at the table between them. "Not the woman you've been sleeping with, not the money that's been moving out of your accounts for over a year. Me." The room was very quiet. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. "Damien," she stood. "I came here tonight because I thought you deserved the conversation. I still believe that." She looked at him. "But I need you to understand something clearly." He looked up at her. "Your brother has been working with Vivian," she said. "Adrian recommended you act against me specifically because it would distract you from looking at them. The legal challenge you quietly started 3 weeks ago? Your attorney will find, when he looks closely at the filing, that someone got there first, that a counterfiling was submitted 2 days ago, before your team even finished drafting." She straightened. "Because I've known about Adrian for 36 hours. And I am not the one in this situation who is behind." She walked to the door. "Figure out who you trust," she said. "You're going to need to decide quickly." She left him sitting there in his restaurant, in his private room, in the wreckage of the narrative he'd been building for 3 weeks, and she walked out into the city night with her hands in her coat pockets and her pulse at exactly the rate it should be. Behind her, she heard his chair scrape. She didn't look back. The call came at 11:40 that night. She was at the apartment on the near north side that almost nobody knew existed. Not the townhouse, not any property in her name. A place held through a trust that held through another trust that her grandfather had established in 1987, and never mentioned to anyone except Gideon. She was at the kitchen table with the manila envelope from the townhouse bookcase open in front of her, reading through papers she had read before but needed to read again when the clean phone vibrated. Gideon's number. "Tell me," she said. "Adrian's accounts," he said. His voice had a quality she recognized, the controlled flatness of a man delivering bad news he has already processed so that he can deliver it cleanly. He's been receiving transfers, not from Vivian's shell structure, different routing, different entities, older. "How old?" "The earliest I can confirm is 22 months ago," he said. "But the structure suggests it was established before that. The entities involved, Celeste, 3 of them trace back to Roman Viscari's legal network, and 2 of them trace to a trust that held Moretti family assets before Damien took operational control." She was very still. "Say that again," she said. "2 of the entities paying Adrian are connected to Moretti Trust assets," Gideon said. "Assets that predate Damien's operational authority. Assets that were controlled for approximately 8 years by Don Salvatore Moretti, the patriarch, Damien's father." She sat back from the table. The papers in front of her suddenly looked different, not in what they said, which hadn't changed, but in what they were part of. "Gideon," she said, "is Don Salvatore connected to Viscari?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell her the answer before he said it. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm going to find out tonight." She looked at the papers on the table. She looked at her own hands. She had built this plan on the assumption that Vivian was the center of the conspiracy, that Adrian was an opportunist who had attached himself to something already in motion, that Damien, whatever his failures, was the deceived party at the operational level. She had been working with an incomplete picture. The picture was larger than she'd thought, and older, and the roots of it went somewhere she hadn't looked because she hadn't had reason to. She pressed her fingers under her jaw. Her pulse was still steady, but it was working harder than it had been this morning. "Find out tonight," she said. "And Gideon, don't talk to anyone. Not anyone. Not until we know." She hung up. She sat alone in her grandfather's hidden apartment, in a city that was humming along in its nighttime business, and she looked at the papers on the table and thought about a man she had trusted all her life, and the 30 years he had spent at her grandfather's side, and the things that 30 years of proximity either built or eroded, and she could not be certain which one it had been. She picked up the papers and read them again from the beginning. This time she was looking for something different. This time she was looking for what she'd missed. She found it at 2:17 in the morning. Not the thing she'd been looking for. She hadn't known what she was looking for exactly, which was the problem with searching for something you'd missed the first time. You had to read everything differently, with a different set of assumptions. The way you reread a letter after you find out the person who wrote it was lying, and suddenly the phrasing that seemed warm reads as calculated, and the omissions you'd filled in charitably become the negative spaces where the truth was hiding. She had been going through the papers from the manila envelope for 2 hours when she found it. A transfer document, dated 14 months ago. Routine looking. The kind of paperwork that got filed and forgotten because it looked like every other routine transfer document in a stack of routine transfer documents. The originating entity was a Carrara estate holding company. The receiving entity was a trust she recognized as part of the Moretti family structure. The authorized signature at the bottom was her grandfather's, Enzo Carrara, 14 months before his death. She had not seen this document before. It had not been in the estate filing she'd reviewed after he died. It had not appeared in any of the succession agreements. It had been in the manila envelope behind the tax manual in the townhouse bookcase, which meant it had been there when Damien moved into that house, which meant someone had put it there before Damien arrived, which meant her grandfather had placed it there specifically. She looked at the receiving trust. She had seen that trust name 2 hours ago in Gideon's documentation. It was one of the two entities connected to Don Salvatore Moretti's assets, the ones that had been paying Adrian. Her grandfather had transferred money to a trust controlled by Salvatore Moretti 14 months before his death. She sat with that. The apartment was very quiet. The refrigerator made a low sound. Somewhere outside, a car moved through the street, and its headlights swept briefly across the ceiling. She pressed her fingers under her jaw. Her pulse was not steady. She picked up the clean phone and called Gideon. It rang 6 times. 7. 8. He didn't answer. She tried again. Same result. She put the phone down on the table and looked at it, and did not yet allow herself to think the thought that was forming at the edge of her mind because she needed more information before she earned the right to think it. She tried a third time at 2:24, and this time it went immediately to voicemail. Not rang, and went to voicemail, but cut straight there, which meant the phone was off or had been turned off. And Gideon did not turn his phone off. She had never in 19 years of knowing him experienced a moment when Gideon Hale's phone was off. She stood up from the table. She put on her coat, put the documents back in the envelope and the envelope in her bag, looked around the apartment with the efficient survey of someone assessing what to take and what to leave. She took her laptop, both phones. The small drive she kept in the kitchen drawer that contained the backup of everything Gideon had sent her in the last 6 weeks. She was out of the apartment in 4 minutes. She drove herself. She hadn't driven herself in 2 years. She'd had a driver, a security arrangement her grandfather had insisted on, and she was aware of the specific discomfort of being alone in a moving vehicle at 2:30 in the morning in a city where things had suddenly become very complicated. She kept the speed even, kept to well-lit streets, watched the mirrors. The building in the West Loop looked different at night, emptier than it should have been. The insurance consulting firm worked odd hours sometimes, had people in at strange times, and there was usually at least one light on somewhere in the upper floors. Tonight the whole building was dark above the 3rd floor. She sat in the car on the opposite side of the street and looked at it. Her phone showed 4 missed calls she hadn't felt come in. She looked at the numbers. 1 was Marco. 2 were from a number she didn't recognize. 1 was from Damien. She called Marco first. He answered on the first ring, which meant he was awake, which meant something had already happened. "Where are you?" he said immediately. "West Loop," she said. "Gideon's building." "Marco, where is—" "Don't go in," he said. Celeste, do not go into that building." She felt something cold move through her chest. "What happened?" "I've been trying to reach you for an hour." His voice was strained in the way Marco's voice only got when he was managing genuine fear. "I went to the Meridian house like you said. I got the drives. I was leaving, and there were 2 men outside, not staff, not anyone I recognized. They were watching the house." "Did they see you?" "I don't think so. I went out the back." A pause. "Celeste, I called Gideon, and he didn't answer. Then I drove past his building and there were cars outside that aren't usually there. Dark SUVs, 2 of them. I didn't stop. She was looking at the building. She could see, now that she was looking for them, the dim shapes of 2 vehicles parked on the far side of the building's entrance. Not parked the way people who lived or worked nearby parked. Parked the way people who were waiting parked. Engines probably running, positioned for fast exit. "Get somewhere safe," she said. "Not your apartment. Not anywhere connected to me. Do you understand?" "Where are you going to—" "Marco." Her voice came out quiet and precise. "Get somewhere safe and stay there and do not contact anyone until I contact you. Yes or no?" A pause. "Yes." She hung up. She looked at the building one more moment. Then she pulled away from the curb slowly, without the headlights, which was probably futile but was instinctive, and drove 3 blocks before turning them on and merging into whatever thin nighttime traffic the city still had moving. She needed to think. She needed to think faster than she had ever needed to think before. She pulled into a 24-hour diner on a commercial strip and sat in the parking lot with the engine running and did not go inside. The light from the diner windows was orange and flat, and the place had 4 cars in its lot and a truck idling at the edge. And none of it had anything to do with her, and she was grateful for the pure indifference of it. She laid out what she knew. Gideon was unreachable. His building was being watched. The Meridian house was being watched. Damien had called her. Damien, who she had left 2 hours ago at his restaurant, and the fact that he'd called her after midnight when everything was fractured between them meant either that he had new information or that he was part of whatever had just moved. The transfer document. Her grandfather's signature on a document she had never seen, moving money to a Salvatore Moretti trust, 14 months before his death. She thought about her grandfather sitting in his garden deadheading roses. She thought about the fact that he had died of a stroke, and that she had never questioned this, had never had reason to question it, had taken it as the kind of death that happened to old men who had lived long and complicated lives. She thought about the fact that the document had been hidden in a house where Damien lived, not hidden in any of the secure locations her grandfather used, not with his attorney, not with Gideon, in Damien's house, where she would have found it only if she was looking, only if something had already gone wrong, only if she'd been given a reason to go looking. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. Her grandfather had not been careless. He had been precise. He had been, in every dealing she had ever observed, 10 steps ahead of the visible situation. He had built succession structures across 27 years and hidden them so well that his own attorneys hadn't known the full architecture. He did not do things accidentally. He did not leave documents somewhere without meaning to leave them. He had put that transfer document in Damien's house because he wanted Celeste to find it. He had wanted her to find it only under the conditions that would lead her to look, which meant he had known something like this was coming, which meant he had known 14 months before he died that there was a connection between the Carrara estate and Salvatore Moretti that she didn't know about, which meant one of 2 things. Either her grandfather had been involved with Salvatore Moretti in ways she didn't know about, or he had discovered something about Salvatore Moretti and had been using that transfer as some form of leverage or insurance. She sat up from the steering wheel. She called the number she didn't recognize. It rang once. "I was wondering how long it would take you," said a voice she did not know. Male. Older. A specific quality of calm that she associated with people who had operated in dangerous situations long enough that the danger no longer produced adrenaline. "Who is this?" she said. "Someone who worked with your grandfather for a long time," the voice said. "Someone he told to wait until you called this number." She felt the hair on her arms move. "He gave you this number to give to me. He gave me this number 4 years ago and told me that if certain things happened in a certain order, you would eventually call it. He said I'd know it was you because you'd call at night and you'd go straight to the question without introducing yourself." A pause. "He also said you'd be in a car." She looked out the windshield at the flat orange light of the diner. "Tell me your name," she said. "Victor Lane," he said. I was your grandfather's private investigator for 9 years. I retired when he retired me, which was 3 years ago, which is a different thing from being asked to leave." "Why did he retire you?" "Because he found out what I'm going to tell you now," Victor said, "and he decided that the fewer people who held that information, the safer the information was. He kept it himself, and he kept it with one document he filed where you'd find it, and he told me to wait for your call." She gripped the steering wheel. Tell me. Your grandfather discovered, 14 months before he died, that Salvatore Moretti had been conducting a parallel operation for years, a separate financial network that ran underneath the official Moretti family structure. Shell companies, offshore accounts, criminal partnerships with Roman Vescari going back 15 years. Not Damien's operation, not anything Damien built. Victor paused. Salvatore's. The patriarch's own, hidden from his own family. Celeste said nothing. Your grandfather confronted Salvatore, Victor said. Privately, without documentation, without lawyers. He told Salvatore he knew. They reached an agreement. The transfer you found was part of that agreement. Salvatore paid for your grandfather's silence. But the payment was also structured as evidence. It tied Salvatore to an admission that the money existed, that it had moved, that it had come from sources that couldn't be explained legitimately. Your grandfather built the receipt of the payment as the weapon. He was holding it over him, Celeste said. For 14 months, Victor said, and then your grandfather died. A beat. And his silence died with him, except he'd left the document where you'd find it. She closed her eyes. Opened them. Salvatore had him killed. I don't know that, Victor said. I believe it. Your grandfather believed it was possible, which is why the document exists. But I don't have proof. She thought about the garden, the roses, a stroke at 83, a clean, plausible death that required no investigation from anyone who didn't already have a reason to look. Vivian, she said. Vivian is Vescari's operative. She was placed there, Victor said. I traced her original employment history last year before I stopped having access to useful databases. Her references check out on the surface. Underneath, there are 3-year gaps and a connection to a financial consulting firm in Bratislava that Vescari's network uses as a recruitment front. And Adrian. She worked through it aloud. Adrian is working with Vescari through the Salvatore Trust. Adrian found out about his father's hidden network approximately 2 years ago, Victor said. I believe Salvatore brought him in deliberately. Adrian is being positioned to take control of the Moretti operation from Damien. Through a combination of the evidence Vivian is building, the financial manipulation she's been conducting, and a plan to expose Damien to federal investigators using the fraudulent transactions that bear his authorization codes. She understood. The whole picture, suddenly, in its full size. Vivian had not been stealing from Damien. She had been building a case against him. 14 months of fraudulent transfers using his credentials, accumulating documentation that would make it look, to any federal investigator, like Damien had been running an illegal financial operation. When the case was complete, Adrian would be in a position to present himself to the family council and to federal authorities simultaneously, the reforming heir who exposed his criminal brother and stepped in to restore order. And underneath all of it, Salvatore Moretti, the patriarch, who had built a hidden empire that ran parallel to his family's visible one for 15 years, was either orchestrating this or was a dead man walking who had been maneuvered into a position where his own network was being used against him by the people he'd trusted with it. Victor, she said, is Gideon safe? A silence that was 2 seconds long and felt like 10. I don't know, he said. I lost contact with him 3 hours ago. She pressed her hand flat against the steering wheel. Where are you? She said. He gave her an address on the southwest side. She put it in her phone without saying anything and ended the call. Then she sat for 30 seconds in the parking lot of the diner with the engine running and the orange light and nobody paying attention to her at all. She had built her plan on a foundation she thought she understood. She had thought she was acting from a position of preparation, of superior knowledge, of controlled advantage. She had thought she was the one who had seen the full picture. She had been looking at a photograph of a room while the building around it was on fire. She put the car in drive. Victor Lane lived in a bungalow on a residential street that was aggressively ordinary, block after block of tidy houses with their porch lights on, a neighborhood that asked nothing and drew no attention. She parked 2 houses down out of habit and walked to the door. He answered before she knocked. He had been watching through the window, which was the right instinct. He was 67 or 68, she estimated, wiry, with a gray beard trimmed close, and eyes that had the particular depth of someone who had spent a career watching people who didn't know they were being watched. He looked at her the way she imagined her grandfather looked at things he was trying to assess quickly. You look like him, Victor said. around the eyes. "I've been told," she said. "Can I come in?" He stepped back. The house was small and completely functional. No decoration that didn't serve a purpose. Books on every flat surface. 2 laptops open on the kitchen table with windows she could see from the doorway that showed financial tracking software and a mapping program. He was already working. "Gideon," she said as she came through the door. "I've been trying to reach him through a secondary contact," said. He moved to the kitchen table and turned one of the laptops toward her. "This is the last signal from his phone before it went dead. West Loop, as you saw." "The SUVs were Vescari's people," she said. "Almost certainly." He pulled the laptop back. "The question is whether they picked him up or whether he went to ground." "Gideon would go to ground," she said, "if he had time." She heard the qualifier in her own voice and didn't take it back. Victor looked at her. "Your grandfather trusted him completely," he said. It was not a reassurance. It was a statement of record. "I know," she said. She sat at the table. Victor poured coffee she hadn't asked for, and she drank it anyway because her body was running on what it had. "Salvatore," she said, "I need to understand his position in this. Is he running Vescari? Is Vescari running him, or have they turned on each other?" "My best assessment," Victor said, sitting across from her, "is that Salvatore and Vescari were partners for 15 years, and that the relationship shifted when Vivian was placed inside Damien's operation. Vescari's play was always larger than what Salvatore intended. Salvatore wanted a hidden supplementary income. Vescari wanted the Moretti empire itself, the name, the network, the legitimacy it could provide for his own operations. So he's using Salvatore's structure to take Salvatore's family," she said. "Through Adrian," Victor said, "who is either Vescari's willing partner or his puppet, and from the financial flows I've seen, I suspect the answer is both at different moments." She thought about Adrian's voice on the phone that afternoon, the specific warmth in it, doing that specific work. "Your family now." "Adrian called me today," she said. "He was checking whether the situation between Damien and me was visible yet. He knew something was in motion." "He's been waiting for a trigger," Victor said. "The frozen accounts were the trigger. Now that it's visible, the next step in the plan that was already built before any of this started today, is to move against Damien formally, present the documentation to the family council, have Damien removed." "The family council," she said. "When?" Victor looked at his laptop. "There's been an emergency session requested." He turned the screen. "Filed this afternoon. By Don Salvatore Moretti." She stared at it. "He filed for an emergency tribunal session against his own son," she said. "The request cites financial irregularities," Victor said. "Specifically, the transfers that Vivian has been building for 14 months. Salvatore knows the transfers are fabricated," she said. "He knows they're Vescari's construction." "Yes," Victor said. "And he filed the tribunal request anyway." She looked at Victor. He looked back. "He's not running Vescari anymore," she said. "He's being run." "Or he's already dead and someone filed using his authority," Victor said quietly. "I haven't been able to confirm Salvatore's physical location in the last 18 hours. The kitchen was very quiet. She thought about a man who had built a hidden empire for 15 years and had believed, the way that kind of man always believes, that he was the one controlling the controlled thing. She thought about the moment when he would have understood that wasn't true, what that felt like, whether there was a garden for him too. "The tribunal," she said. "When is it scheduled?" 48 hours, Victor said. "Day after tomorrow." "And the documentation they plan to present, the fabricated financial evidence against Damien, where is it held?" "Vivian has the primary package," Victor said. "She's been building it for 14 months. My assumption is it's digital, encrypted, and she has control of the decryption." "Then Vivian needs to be found before that tribunal," Celeste said. "She's not at Damien's office. She cleared out her personal effects this afternoon." Victor's voice was precise. "Her apartment is empty. I had someone check an hour ago. Her car is at O'Hare long-term parking." Celeste felt something shift inside her. Not panic. Panic was for situations where you had no options. This was something colder. "She's running." "Or she's already run," Victor said. "Or she's being held somewhere for operational reasons until the tribunal is complete and she's no longer needed." Celeste stood up. She moved to the window. Habit, surveillance habit, checking the street from inside the room. The street was empty and ordinary. Porch lights, parked cars. Thing that shouldn't be there. Her grandfather's voice, from some memory she couldn't place exactly. The most dangerous move is the one you make when you're reacting instead of deciding. She was reacting. She was doing it right now, moving from point to point, trying to catch up to something that was already 3 moves ahead of where she'd thought she was standing. She had to stop reacting. "Victor," she said, "what did my grandfather leave me? The actual thing. Not the document, not the number to call. What did he leave that's supposed to matter?" Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he got up from the table and went to a closet in the hallway. She heard him moving things. He came back with a flat metal case, the kind used for archival storage, fireproof, water-resistant, the kind her grandfather had used for things he was serious about protecting. He set it on the table. "He left this with me 6 months before he died," Victor said. "He told me to give it to you when you were ready to need it." She looked at the case. "He was precise about that phrasing," Victor said. "When she's ready to need it. Not when she asks, or when she finds the number. When she's ready to need it." She put both hands flat on the case. The latches were combination locks. Victor gave her a small piece of paper with 2 8-digit sequences that her grandfather had written in his own handwriting. She recognized the slant of the numbers immediately, the specific way he formed his 7s. She worked the combinations and the case opened. Inside, 4 encrypted drives, a sealed legal envelope, a leather notebook, and a photograph. She picked up the photograph first. It was a picture of her grandfather and Salvatore Moretti, younger, 15, 20 years ago. They were sitting at a table somewhere that looked like an Italian restaurant, both of them laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. They looked like old friends. They looked like men who trusted each other. On the back of the photograph, in her grandfather's handwriting, "S knows where the bodies are. So do I. The difference is, I wrote it down." She turned the photograph over and looked at their faces again. She had understood the situation wrong from the beginning, not the details. She had been largely right about the details, about Vivian, about Adrian, about the transfers. But the weight of it, the center of gravity, she had understood it wrong. This was not a story about Damien's betrayal of her. This was a story about 2 old men, each of whom believed he was the one who had outsmarted the other, and what happened to everyone who stood near them when they were both wrong. She set the photograph down. She opened the leather notebook. Her grandfather's handwriting dense and precise. Dates going back 18 years. Names she recognized and names she didn't. Financial references in his personal shorthand that she had learned years ago and could read without effort. She turned pages until she found the section marked with a red line at the corner, the section that began 14 months before his death. She read. She read for 20 minutes without speaking. Victor sat at the table with his coffee and did not interrupt her. Outside, a dog barked twice somewhere down the street, and then stopped. When she finished reading, she put the notebook face down on the table and looked at her hands. "He knew Vivian was Vescry's operative," she said. "He identified her 11 months before he died." "Yes," Victor said. He knew Adrian had been brought into the network. Her voice was even. She was keeping it even deliberately because the alternative was something she couldn't afford right now. He knew that Vescari's play was the Moretti Empire. He knew all of it. He put it together over about 6 months, Victor said, that last section of the notebook. Then why? She stopped, restarted. He had all of this. He had the evidence, the documentation, the leverage. He had held this over Salvatore for 14 months. Why didn't he act on it? Why did he leave it for me instead of burning it down himself? Victor looked at her for a long moment. "Because he got sick," Victor said quietly. "The stroke that killed him. He had a smaller event 8 months before. A warning. His doctors told him he had months, maybe a year, before another one. He couldn't guarantee he had enough time to execute what needed to be executed." A pause. "So he built the structure for you to execute instead." She sat with that for a very long time. Her grandfather, in his garden, knowing he was running out of time, building the architecture anyway, putting pieces in places where she would find them in the right order when the time was right, trusting her not just with the information, but with the judgment of how to use it. He had built this for her, and she had walked into it 3 moves behind because she hadn't known there was a game already in progress. "The drives," she said. "What's on them?" Everything he documented, Victor said. 18 years of Salvatore and Viscari's operation. Every transfer, every communication he intercepted, every piece of evidence he gathered, unencrypted and formatted for legal presentation. She looked at the drives. He was going to take them to the family council himself, she said. Yes, Victor said. And now I have 48 hours before the tribunal convenes, she said. A tribunal that's been called to remove Damien using fabricated evidence, at which point Adrian steps in and delivers the Moretti Empire to Viscari on a structured timeline, while Salvatore Moretti is either complicit or already dead. She stood up from the table. The plan she had walked into this crisis with, her plan, the elegant and controlled plan she had built with Gideon, the one that froze accounts and triggered legal reviews and was supposed to dismantle Damien's position piece by careful piece from the safety of her own superior preparation, that plan was gone. It had been built to fight the situation she'd thought she was in. She was in a different situation entirely. I need to find Gideon, she said, and I need to find Vivian before Viscari decides she's no longer useful. She put the drives in her bag, and the notebook, and the sealed legal envelope. And I need to talk to Damien. Victor looked up at her sharply. Damien. He doesn't know any of this, she said. He doesn't know what Vivian was actually doing. He doesn't know his father is connected to Viscari. He doesn't know the tribunal was filed against him by his own father's name, and he has 48 hours before 12 families vote on his removal based on 14 months of fabricated evidence. She looked at Victor. Whatever he did to me, and he did things, he is being set up to be destroyed. And the documentation that could save him or damn the people doing it is in this bag. You're going to help him, Victor said. It wasn't disapproval. It was something more careful, assessment. I'm going to need him, she said. There's a difference. She picked up her bag. The weight of it was considerable. The tribunal is in 48 hours, she said. If we don't walk into that room with everything my grandfather built, all of it, presented correctly, before Adrian and Viscari have a chance to control the narrative, then it doesn't matter what I own on paper. The family council will recognize Adrian as the legitimate successor. Viscari's operation absorbs the Moretti network, and everything my grandfather spent his life building becomes the foundation of something he would have. She stopped. She pressed her fingers under her jaw. Her pulse was hard and fast, and she let it be, just this once. Let it run at the rate it needed to run. 48 hours, she said again. And she walked to Victor's front door and out into the ordinary street, where the porch lights were still on, and a dog was still somewhere quiet, and the city had no idea what was about to happen inside it. She called Damien from the car. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he hadn't slept either, which meant the information she'd left him with at the restaurant had been working on him for the last 4 hours, the way she'd intended it to. I need to see you, she said. Now. Tonight. A pause. She could hear him breathing, the specific quality of it, controlled but effortful. Where? Somewhere that isn't your house, your office, or anywhere connected to your operation, she said. Somewhere nobody would look for either of us. Another pause, shorter. There's a garage on Halstead, 3rd floor. I'll text you the address. Come alone, she said. I was going to say the same thing, he said, and hung up. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the heat on because she was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the last 6 hours. The drives were in her bag on the passenger seat. She was aware of them, the way you're aware of something loaded and dangerous sitting within arm's reach. Not afraid of it, just conscious of it, the specific weight of what it contained. Her grandfather's 18 years of documentation, the thing that could either save the Moretti Empire or end it. She had not yet decided which she wanted it to do. The garage on Halstead was 3 levels of poured concrete and bad lighting, the kind of structure that existed in every city as a byproduct of development that had happened around it while it stayed the same. At 3:20 in the morning, the 3rd level had 7 cars in it and no attendant, and the kind of stillness that comes from being above street level in a city that is mostly asleep. Damien was already there when she pulled in. He was standing beside his car with his jacket off despite the cold, his arms crossed, and he looked like he had not slept and had not tried to. He watched her pull in and park and get out of the car with an expression she could not fully classify in the poor light. She walked to him, stopped 3 feet away. Before you say anything, he said, Adrian filed a tribunal request against you, she said, using your father's name. It's scheduled for 48 hours from now. Whatever he'd been about to say stayed where it was. The family council will convene the day after tomorrow, she continued. The documentation they plan to present is 14 months of fraudulent financial transfers that use your authorization codes and look, to anyone reading them without context, like you've been running an illegal operation that channels Moretti funds into Roman Vescari's network. He stared at her. Vivian built it, she said. That was the job. Not stealing from you. Building the case against you, piece by piece, every Tuesday and Friday for over a year. Vivian. He said her name in a way that was different from every other time she had heard him say it. Emptied out. She's gone, Celeste said. She cleared her office this afternoon, her apartment, her car at O'Hare. She watched his face. She built what she was sent to build, and she's finished. Sent. His voice had gone very quiet. Sent by who? Vescari, she said. But the entry point was your father's network. She watched it land. She watched him process it, watched the muscles in his jaw work, watched something in his eyes move through a sequence of responses too fast to track individually. She had seen Damien absorb hard information before. He was good at it. He compressed things quickly and moved forward. This was different. This was the specific shock of something that upended not just a situation, but a person's understanding of the foundation they'd been standing on. My father, he said. Salvatore has been running a parallel operation for 15 years, she said, hidden from the family, hidden from you. Vescari was his partner. What Vescari wanted eventually was the Moretti Empire itself, the name, the network. He's been working toward that through Adrian for 2 years. Adrian is working with Vescari. Not a question. His voice was processing out loud. Yes. And my father. He stopped. Is my father... I don't know where your father is, she said. Victor Lane hasn't been able to confirm his location in 18 hours. Who is Victor Lane? My grandfather's private investigator, she said. The man my grandfather left his documentation with. 18 years of documentation on your father and Vescari's operation, Damien. Formatted for legal presentation, ready to be placed in front of the family council. He was very still. Your grandfather knew, he said. He figured it out 14 months before he died, she said. He was building the case. He ran out of time. She watched him understand the implication of that. She watched him reach it and then set it aside. Not because it didn't matter, but because there was a more immediate thing that needed handling, and he was, whatever else was true of him, a man who understood sequencing. 48 hours, he said. 48 hours? She said. He looked at her. In the bad garage light, in the specific exhaustion of 3:30 in the morning after a day that had begun as their wedding, he looked like a man who had been building something his whole life and had just discovered the ground under it was somebody else's. What do you need? He said. Gideon, she said immediately. I need to find Gideon. His phone went dead around midnight and his building was being watched. I need your security contacts, the ones who aren't connected to Adrian or anyone in your father's network. 2 men, he said. No connection to anyone in the family. I use them for personal security only. Off book. He pulled out his phone. I'll call them now. I also need Vivian, she said. Not to disappear into Vescari's protection, not to get on a plane. I need her found. If she's at O'Hare, her car is at O'Hare, Celeste said. That's what Vescari's people wanted us to find. She's not at O'Hare. He looked at her for a moment. You think he's keeping her? I think she's more useful as a controlled witness than as a loose end, she said, and I think Vescari is precise about his useful things. She picked up her bag. I have drives. Everything my grandfather documented. I need somewhere secure to work from, not connected to any property you own or I own, where I can access this material, organize it for presentation, and communicate without exposure. Victor Lane's location, he said. Victor Lane's house is compromised by now, she said. If Vescari's people are tracking Gideon, they're tracking anyone who connects to my grandfather's network. I need something clean. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, Marco. She looked at him. Your cousin Marco has a warehouse space on the northwest side, he said. Industrial district. He uses it for... I don't actually know what he uses it for, but I know it's not in any record connected to either of us, because I checked when you and I first became serious. He said the last part without inflection, which was its own kind of honesty. It's clean. She hadn't known he'd checked Marco's properties. She filed that without commenting on it. Call your men, she said. And Damien. She met his eyes. If anyone in your network has any connection to your father's operation that you haven't told me about, tell me now. Because in 48 hours, we are walking into a room with 12 families, and we cannot walk in with a leak. He held her gaze. There's no one. Are you certain? I am certain, he said, with the specific weight of a man who has just spent 4 hours reviewing his certainties and found this one still standing. She nodded. Then let's go. Marco's warehouse space was exactly what Damien had described. A large industrial unit in a block of large industrial units that all looked identical from the outside, and whose inside Marco had furnished with the cheerful pragmatism of a man who needed a place to put things without explaining what things. It had a functional bathroom, a space heater, a work table of raw plywood that was stronger than it looked, and crucially, a hardwired internet connection that Marco had run himself 3 years ago and that appeared in no service record under his name. Marco was there when they arrived. He looked at Damien with the specific expression of a man who has been told to be a professional but is finding that professionally difficult. He said nothing. That was Marco at his best. Celeste sat up at the work table. She plugged in the first drive, her grandfather's documentation, 18 years of it, and began to move through it with the systematic efficiency of someone who had spent years reading financial records and knew how to find the architecture inside them fast. Damien's 2 security men, a former military contractor named Reyes and a taller man named Darrow, who said almost nothing and seemed to prefer it, had split up, one going to the West Loop to surveil Gideon's building and one going to the last known location of Vivian's cellular signal before it had gone dark. Victor Lane arrived at 4:40. He'd driven himself, which he was too old to do at this hour, but which he'd done anyway, and he sat down across from Celeste at the work table and helped her cross-reference documentation with a speed that reminded her why her grandfather had trusted him. By 6 in the morning, she had a presentation structure. By 7:15, she had the evidentiary spine, the financial flows from Salvatore's hidden network to Vescari, the 14 months of Vivian's fabrication work laid alongside the legitimate authorization patterns that proved the discrepancy, the transfer document with Salvatore's payment to her grandfather, and the succession agreements that established her ownership position unambiguously. At 7:40, Reyes called from the West Loop. She put it on speaker. Building is clear, he said. Whoever was watching left between 4 and 5 this morning. There's a man inside. Ground floor lobby. He's been there a while. She was on her feet. Describe him. 60, 61. Gray at the temples. Looks like he walked through something and came out the other side. A pause. He's got a phone in each hand and he's looking at the door. That's Gideon, she said. Get him out of there. What? Gideon arrived at the warehouse at 8:20 with a bruised jaw and a quality of careful movement that suggested his ribs weren't fully cooperating. He had been in the building since 1 in the morning, had gone to ground inside his own office when he'd seen the SUVs arrive, had spent 7 hours in a server room on the 11th floor with the lights off, listening to 2 of Vescari's men move through the floors below him, and then, eventually, leave. He sat down at the work table, looked at the drives, the organized documentation, Celeste, and then Damien in that order. He looked at Celeste. How much do you have? Enough, she said. My grandfather's full documentation. Something moved across Gideon's face. Relief, she thought. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying a weight and found that someone else had been carrying the counterweight all along. Victor. He was waiting, she said. Gideon nodded slowly. He pressed one hand flat on the table. His left, she noticed, not his right, which meant his right side was the one that was hurting. The tribunal. 39 hours, she said. Vivian, he said, we're working on it. He looked at the table. Something in his expression shifted, the relief draining slightly, replaced by the specific look of a man who has information he hasn't delivered yet. She had known Gideon long enough to read that look. What? She said. He reached into his jacket and produced his tablet, opened it, turned it toward her. She looked at the screen. It was a photograph. A man, seated in what appeared to be a room with no windows. Older, 70s, she estimated, with white hair and the bearing, even seated, even in a situation that was clearly not voluntary, of someone who was accustomed to commanding rooms. Salvatore Moretti. "When did you get this?" she said. "It came through my secondary contact at 3 this morning," Gideon said. "Anonymous send. The metadata is scrubbed." He looked at Damien. "I'm sorry." Damien was looking at the photograph. His father, in a windowless room, in a situation that required no interpretation. "He's alive," Damien said. "As of 3 this morning," Gideon said. "Yes." Damien's hand came up to his face, not hiding it, just pressing the heel of his palm against his forehead, the way people do when they are managing something that is happening in real time inside their chest. He held it there for 3 seconds. Then he lowered his hand. "Adrian sent this," he said. Not a question. "Or Viscari," Celeste said, "as proof of leverage, as a message that the situation has moved past what anyone can reverse." "They're wrong about that," Damien said. His voice was flat and very specific. She looked at him. She had heard him be angry before, had heard him be cold, calculating, ruthless in the quiet way that powerful men in his world were ruthless. But this was different. This was something underneath the performance of control, something that had been a son, once, and had just seen a picture of his father in a windowless room. "Damien," she said. "I know," he said. He looked at her. "I know. 48 hours. I know." He straightened. "What do we still need?" "Vivian," she said. "If she doesn't testify or provide the decryption for the fabricated evidence package, the council will see Vescari's construction and our rebuttal and have to choose which to believe. With her testimony, with the actual evidence decrypted and shown to be fabricated, there's no choice to make." "Darrow is tracking her last signal," Reyes said from the doorway. She had not heard him come back in. "And," she said, reading his face. "Signal came back online 20 minutes ago," he said. 14 blocks from Viscari's known Chicago property, a hotel." He looked at Celeste. "It's not her phone. It's the pattern. Her device habits, the way she connects and disconnects. Darrow recognized it." "She's being held at the hotel," Celeste said. "Or she's there voluntarily," Damien said. "It doesn't matter," Celeste said. "Either way, she's there." She looked at Reyes. "I need to talk to her, before tonight." Reyes and Damien exchanged a look that had about 9 words in it that no one said aloud. "That's Viscari's territory," Reyes said carefully. "I know what territory it is," she said. The hotel was a mid-range business property 8 blocks from the lakefront, the kind of place that hosted small corporate conferences and asked no questions that weren't on the check-in form. Celeste checked in under the clean identity she had maintained for 4 years against exactly this kind of contingency: a credit card, a name, a woman who existed on paper and nowhere else. Darrow had given her the floor and a room number, established by pattern recognition, and a contact inside the hotel's security system who owed Reyes something Reyes had not explained. She rode the elevator to the 7th floor alone. She walked the corridor without hesitating. Hesitation was visible and she could not afford visible. Room 714. She knocked twice. Waited. Knocked once more. A long silence. Then the sound of movement. Careful, cautious movement. Someone who had been trained not to open doors without information. "It's Celeste Moretti," she said. Quietly, clearly. "I'm alone. I have 43 hours before a tribunal that will go badly for both of us if you don't talk to me." A longer silence. The door opened on the chain first, one eye in the gap, dark, assessing, frightened in a way that high competence couldn't entirely suppress. Then the chain came off. Vivian Cross opened the door. She looked like she had not slept in 2 days. She was still impeccably put together in the way of someone for whom presentation was a professional discipline, but underneath the presentation she looked like a person who had arrived at a position she had not anticipated and was managing it with the only tools she had. She stepped back from the doorway. Celeste walked in. The room had a chair that someone had moved to face the door, surveillance positioning, the habit of a trained mind, and a laptop open on the bed and 2 phones and the particular quality of a space someone was occupying without unpacking. Vivian did not sit. She stood near the window with her arms crossed and watched Celeste move into the room with the expression of someone calibrating how much danger they were in. "You're not here to threaten me," Vivian said. "No," Celeste said. Then what? I need the decryption for the evidence package, Celeste said, and I need your testimony in front of the family council in 43 hours. Vivian laughed, a short, precise sound with no humor in it. You understand what you're asking? I understand exactly what I'm asking, Celeste said. I'm asking you to testify against Roman Viscari in a room full of people who either fear him or owe him. I'm asking you to hand over the key to 14 months of work you built at considerable personal risk. She kept her voice level. I'm also telling you that in 43 hours, when that tribunal convenes, if your package is presented without your testimony alongside it, without the decryption showing that it was fabricated, Viscari will have everything he came for. The Moretti Empire goes to Adrian, the network absorbs, and you are a loose end. Something moved in Vivian's face. He will not protect you, Celeste said. Not cruelly, just precisely. You've been operational for 3 years. Your cover is burned. I found you, which means others can find you. You've served your function. What happens to people who serve their function in his organization after the function is complete? Vivian looked at the window. Outside, the lake was gray in the early morning, and the city was getting itself onto its feet for an ordinary day. I have conditions, Vivian said. I expected conditions, Celeste said. Full immunity from the council, Vivian said. My testimony is given under protection, not just from Viscari, from the Moretti organization, from everyone in that room. I can guarantee Moretti protection, Celeste said. I can't guarantee what the other 11 families decide. Then get me federal protection, Vivian said. Before the tribunal, not after, before I walk into that room. Celeste looked at her. The calculation was running. She could see it happening in Vivian's eyes too. 2 women in a hotel room at 8 in the morning, both doing rapid risk assessment in real time. I have contacts, Celeste said carefully. People my grandfather worked with in the federal system. I can make calls. I cannot promise what comes back in 43 hours. Try, Vivian said. And if you get me something real, something in writing, you get the decryption key and you get me in that room. And Viscari, Celeste said, everything you know about his operation, not just the Moretti piece, the full network. Vivian's jaw tightened. That's the condition, Celeste said. Not optional. A long silence. He has a facility, Vivian said finally, on the south side. He keeps operational materials there, drives, physical records, financials. It's where he stages things. She stopped. Where? Celeste said. Vivian looked at her. If I tell you that, there's no walking it back. There's already no walking it back, Celeste said. There's only which direction you walk forward. She was back at the warehouse by 10. She laid out what she had and what she needed, and everyone around the work table understood, without her having to frame it carefully, that the situation had just added a variable that changed the physical risk profile significantly. He keeps materials at a Southside facility, she said. I need to know what's there, and I need to know if Salvatore Moretti is there. Reyes and Darrow looked at each other. That's a Viscari property, Darrow said. Active. Yes, she said. If Viscari's people are running operations from that location, and we go in, I'm not asking you to go in shooting, she said. I'm asking you to confirm what's there. Surveillance. Fast. She looked at them. We have 38 hours. Damien spoke from the other side of the table. I'll go. Every head in the room turned. It's my father, he said, and it's my name they're using in that tribunal. He looked at Reyes. You know this kind of approach. You've done it. I've done it with preparation and backup and a clean exit, Reyes said. Not in 38 hours with half a team. Then we prepare in 38 hours, Damien said. Celeste looked at him. She thought about the photograph of his father in the windowless room. She thought about a man who had been told his entire life that he was the head of something that had never, in the most fundamental sense, belonged to him, and who was now, for the first time, choosing a direction that was fully his own. You're not doing it alone, she said. He looked at her. I go with you, she said. That's... He stopped. Something in his face that she couldn't name. That's not... Those drives don't mean anything if we don't walk into that tribunal with everything, she said, including whatever is in that facility, including your father, if he's alive. She held his eyes. And I am not sitting in this warehouse for the next 8 hours when there is still something that needs to be done. A silence. Reyes looked at Darrow. Darrow almost shrugged. We'd need a layout, Reyes said. Entry points, current occupancy. We go dark. No phones, no devices. And we're in and out in under 20 minutes. Victor can get a layout, Gideon said from the corner where he'd been sitting quietly. His voice was careful because of his ribs. He has contacts in city planning that go back to the original permits. Get it, Celeste said. We move at 1800. They moved at 6:15, four of them. Celeste, Damien, Reyes, and Darrow. Marco stayed with Gideon and Victor at the warehouse. Nobody liked that arrangement except Marco, who understood it was the right one and was therefore professionally miserable about it. The facility was a warehouse unit, different from Marco's, older, a section of the Southside Industrial District that had been declining for 20 years in the particular slow way of city infrastructure that had outlived its original purpose. The unit was listed in city records as a commercial cold storage operation, which was sufficiently plausible to avoid scrutiny and sufficiently functional to explain activity at odd hours. Victor's layout showed two entry points, a main floor and a basement level accessed by an interior staircase. They went in through the secondary entrance at the east side. Reyes went first, then Darrow, then Damien, then Celeste, who had never done this before in her life and whose body was doing several things simultaneously. Adrenaline making her hands feel remote and large, her heartbeat loud in a way she could feel in her throat, her breath controlled by pure discipline because the alternative was to let it run, and she was not going to let it run. The main floor was inactive. Storage racks, equipment she didn't identify, the smell of cold concrete and machine oil, low light from emergency strips near the floor. Reyes moved through it with a speed that was almost silent, Darrow covering the angles, and she followed Damien and kept her eyes moving the way Victor had told her to keep them, not focusing on one thing, letting the peripheral field do the work. The staircase to the basement was at the far end. Reyes held up a fist, stopped. She heard it too. Voices, below. Two, maybe three people. The low specific register of men who believed themselves to be unobserved. Reyes looked at Darrow. Something communicated. Darrow went left, Reyes went right, and they moved down the stairs in a sequence she didn't entirely follow, but which resulted, in approximately 40 seconds, in a controlled situation that she processed in fragments. Two men, disarmed, on the ground, Darrow's knee in one back, and Reyes holding the other in a grip that precluded any useful movement, a room at the far end. Door, not locked. Damien pushed it open. Salvatore Moretti was seated in a chair with his hands zip-tied to the armrests and his eyes open and aware, which meant he was conscious and had been for some time. I was thinner than the photographs Celeste had seen. His white hair was disordered, but his eyes, dark, specific, the same shape as Damien's eyes, were alert and calculating, even here, even now, and she understood looking at him why he had survived as long as he had in the world he'd built. He looked at his son. "Damien," he said. His voice was rough. "Papa?" Damien crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched in front of the chair. His hands found the zip ties, testing them. "Are you hurt?" "Ribs," the old man said. "Nothing that needs a hospital." "We're getting you out," Damien said. Salvatore looked over his son's shoulder at Celeste, who had come to stand in the doorway. The old man's gaze was direct and careful, and she held it without moving. "You're Enzo's girl," he said. "Yes," she said. "He told me once you were the best thing he ever built." A pause. "I thought he was being sentimental." Another pause. "I was wrong." Damien was working at the ties with a folding knife from Reyes. His hands were steady. She watched them and thought that steadiness must run in some direction she hadn't fully mapped. The old man looked back at his son. "Adrian." "I know," Damien said. His voice was even. "We'll deal with Adrian." "Viscari won't let them." "Papa." Damien's voice was quiet and final. "I know. We're dealing with it." The last tie came free. Salvatore's hands moved to his knees. "Can you walk?" "I can walk," the old man said, with the specific dignity of someone who was going to walk if it cost him everything. Damien helped him up anyway. From above them, through the ceiling and the concrete floors of the industrial unit, they heard it simultaneously, the sound of vehicles. More than one, moving fast, stopping. Reyes appeared in the doorway with his jaw set. "We have company." "How many?" Damien said. "3 vehicles," Reyes said. "Call it 8 to 10. Damien looked at Celeste. She looked back. She thought about 43 hours. She thought about the drives in the warehouse with Gideon. She thought about Vivian in her hotel room. She thought about the family council assembling in a room somewhere in this city where 12 men were going to vote on the shape of everything she had spent her whole life positioned to inherit. She thought about her grandfather deadheading roses and knowing he was running out of time and building it anyway. "There's another exit," she said. "Victor's layout." She had it memorized. "The northeast loading dock, but it bypasses the main floor. If they came in from the south and east..." "Northeast is clear," Darrow said from the stairs. "For now." "For now" was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Above them the sounds sharpened, boots on concrete. The structural echo of the main floor ceiling transmitting movement in a way that told her the people up there knew the layout and were moving through it with purpose and speed. "Go," Reyes said. Damien had his father's arm across his shoulders, and they moved. Not running, because the old man couldn't run, but moving at the fastest pace that kept him upright. Through the basement toward the northeast stair access that Victor's layout had shown as a secondary freight path. Darrow went ahead. Reyes came behind. She was in the middle, and she was not calm. She had stopped performing calm because there was nobody watching who needed the performance, and her heart was doing something architectural and loud in her chest, and her legs were moving with the specific mechanical reliability of a body that has decided this is not the moment to be difficult. The freight stair came up into a loading bay, dark, smelling of diesel and cold air. And Darrow was already at the dock door, reading it, making a decision in about 2 seconds that she couldn't see the criteria for, but which resulted in him pushing the door open and the cold night air coming in sharp and real. They came out into an alley. From the south side of the building, she heard shouting. Then a sound that was not shouting, sharp, definitive, the kind of sound that reorganized the nervous system's priorities immediately. "Move," Darrow said. No inflection, just direction. They moved. The alley was 140 feet of exposed distance between where they were and where the vehicles waited 2 blocks over. The secondary staging point that Reyes had established, because Reyes established secondary staging points, the way other people established habits, automatically and without particular drama. Celeste ran. She had not run like this in years. Not sprinting, not tracked running, but the desperate, purposeful running of someone covering ground because the ground needed covering, and that was the only relevant fact. Damien ran with his father. Darrow was ahead, Reyes was behind. She was aware of her breath, ragged and real, and the alley surface uneven under her feet, and the cold air tearing through her throat, and the distance between the building behind her and the vehicles ahead shrinking with each stride in a way that was producing something close to pure animal relief. They reached the vehicles. She got in. Damien got in with Salvatore. The doors hadn't fully closed when Reyes pulled out, no lights, moving through the industrial district with the specific controlled speed of someone who knew these streets and was threading the available gap. She pressed her back against the seat. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them, both of them, in the dim dark of the moving vehicle, and noted the shaking with the detached part of her brain that was always running the observation track, and then she put them flat on her thighs and pressed down until the shaking had something to push against. Salvatore Moretti was in the front seat with his head against the headrest and his eyes closed and his breathing labored but present. Damien was beside her in the back, close enough that she could feel the heat of him. He was running warm, adrenaline doing its metabolic work. And in the dark moving vehicle she was aware of him, the way she'd been aware of that drive sitting in her bag. Not with fear, just with the specific weight of what he represented. He put his hand over hers, not squeezing, not making something of it, just covering it. The way you put a hand over something that's shaking to tell it. There is weight here. There is something solid. She looked at his hand. She did not move it. Outside, the city moved past. The industrial district gave way to through streets, gave way to the particular gray anonymity of a city. At dusk, between one thing and whatever came next. 37 hours. In 37 hours, the family council would convene. 12 men in a room. The documentation she had. The testimony Vivian had agreed to give. Salvatore Moretti, Oh, to speak to his own network's history. The truth of who had built what and who had stolen what and whose name was on what in the actual permanent record of the world. It was enough. She had to believe it was enough. She pressed her hands flat and looked out the window and did not let herself think about the things that could still go wrong, because the list was long and the hours were short, and she needed every one of those hours for what was still ahead. Reyes's phone buzzed in the cup holder. He glanced at it, said nothing for a moment, then, "Vescari's people hit the warehouse on the northwest side." Her whole body went cold. "Gideon," she said. "Marco got them out," Reyes said. His voice was controlled in the specific way of someone delivering information they haven't finished processing. "Victor too, but the drives—" He stopped. She already knew. "The drives," she said. "Gone," he said. The vehicle kept moving. The city kept moving. 37 hours, and the primary evidence her grandfather had spent 18 years building was in Vescari's hands. And the tribunal was still coming, and she was sitting in the back of a car in the dark with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and nowhere left to retreat to. She closed her eyes. 1 second, then she opened them. "Gideon has the backup," she said. Her voice came out steady. "The drive I pulled from the apartment. He has it. I gave it to him this morning before we left." She looked at Reyes. "Tell me Gideon has it." Reyes spoke into his phone in a low voice. She waited. 10 seconds. 15. "He has it," Reyes said. She exhaled. It was a partial backup. Incomplete. The full 18 years of documentation was gone, was in Vescari's hands now, and she had no way to recover it in 37 hours. What Gideon had was 6 weeks of Gideon's own investigation, the framework of what she'd organized at the warehouse table, and the financial flow evidence for the fabricated transfers. It was not everything. It was not the overwhelming case her grandfather had spent years building. But it was enough to make an argument, enough to raise a reasonable doubt in 12 careful men. Enough. If Vivian held, if Salvatore testified, if she could stand in front of the family council and hold the room the way she had watched her grandfather hold rooms her entire life, it had to be enough. Because in 37 hours she was walking into that room regardless, with what she had, and she was going to do what her grandfather had built her to do. She pressed 2 fingers under her jaw. Her pulse was hard and unsteady, and she left it alone this time, let it run at the rate it needed to run, because some things deserved to be felt before you brought them under control, and this was one of those things, and she had 37 hours to bring it back. Outside the window, the city lights were coming on. Tomorrow, everything ended or everything changed. She had stopped being certain which one it would be. She did not sleep. There was no point pretending she might. She sat in the back room of a rented space that Reyes had sourced through a contact who asked no questions. A furnished apartment above a dry cleaning business on the north side, the kind of place that existed in every city as a feature of certain economies, and she worked through the night with Gideon beside her and the partial backup drive open on the laptop, and 37 hours that became 30, became 22, became 15, while she organized and reorganized what they had into the most coherent possible argument for 12 men who would rather not be there. Gideon worked without complaint, which was what he always did. His ribs were taped now. Marco had found medical tape and made himself useful in the only way he could, which was quietly and without drama. Victor Lane sat in the corner with the leather notebook and cross-referenced dates, while Darrow and Reyes took shifts watching the street below. Salvatore slept in the single bedroom, which everyone had agreed on without discussion. He was 69 years old and had been zip-tied to a chair for an indeterminate number of hours, and his ribs were worse than Gideon's. When he woke at 4 in the morning and walked carefully to the kitchen for water, Celeste was the only other person awake, and they sat across a small table from each other in the dark apartment without speaking for several minutes. Then Salvatore said, "Your grandfather was a better man than I was." She looked at him. "Not a good man," he said. "Better. There's a difference." He turned the water glass in his hands. He knew when to stop. "I never learned that." She didn't offer him absolution. He wasn't asking for it. "Will you testify?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation, as if he had decided this some time ago, perhaps in the chair in the windowless room, perhaps earlier. "I'll testify to everything. My network, the Vescari partnership, what Adrian knew and when." He set the glass down. "It won't fix what I built, but it will end it honestly." She looked at his face in the kitchen light. The shape of Damien's eyes, older, exhausted, stripped of the performance that powerful men wear so constantly they forget it's a performance. "Why did you bring Adrian in?" The old man was quiet for a moment. "Because I thought I could control it. The way I thought I could control everything." He looked at the table. "Vescari told me Adrian was the right successor, more flexible than Damien, more willing to work within the new structure." He paused. "I believed him because I wanted the structure to continue. I was more concerned with the continuation than with what it would cost." She thought about what Vescari's version of continuation looked like. The Moretti name absorbed into a criminal network, the legitimate businesses hollowed out, the empire her grandfather had spent decades intertwining with becoming raw material for someone else's ambition. "You have a chance to end it differently," she said. "I know," he said. He picked up the water glass again. "That's why I'm awake." Well, Damien found her at 7 in the morning, standing at the window with cold coffee, watching the street. He looked like she probably looked, functional, barely, running on something that wasn't sleep. He stood beside her at the window without saying anything for a moment. "My father talked to me," he said, "last night, before he slept." She waited. "He told me about Enzo," he said, "what your grandfather found, what he held over him." He looked out the window. "He said Enzo never threatened to use it, never leveraged it for anything additional after the initial agreement, just held it, and kept working with me like nothing had changed." She thought about her grandfather, the particular way he had of separating what he knew from how he behaved. Not dishonest, just structured, compartmented. He had known, for 14 months, that Salvatore Moretti had a network that could consume everything they had both built, and he had continued to work with her, to build her the architecture she would need, without ever letting her see the fear underneath it. He had carried it alone so she wouldn't carry it before she needed to. He was protecting the timeline, she said. He needed things to fall in the right order. "I know," Damien said. "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I just wanted you to know that he didn't use it. He could have. He had the leverage. He chose not to." She looked at her coffee cup. "That was who he was," she said. Damien was quiet for a moment, then, "What he built. The succession agreements, the trust structures, everything that means the empire is legally yours." He paused. "I didn't know. I want you to understand that." "I know you didn't," she said. "Adrian told me you were a hidden threat," he said. "I believed him because it was easier to believe you were the problem than to look at what was actually wrong." He turned from the window. "That was my failure. Not just what happened between us. That specific failure of judgment." She looked at him. The morning light was thin and gray, and it showed everything without flattery. The tiredness, the specific weight of a man who had spent the last 48 hours having his understanding of his own life restructured at speed. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because in 3 hours we walk into a room," he said. "And whatever happens in that room, however it goes, I wanted to have said it before we went in." He held her eyes. "I'm sorry, Celeste. For the wedding night. For the 3 weeks before it. For believing the easier story." She was quiet for a long moment. "I know," she said finally. "Not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not in the shape he was hoping for, but acknowledgement. Recognition that the words had been said and received." "Let's get through today?" He nodded. She turned back to the window. Outside, the city was getting itself together for a Thursday. Ordinary traffic, ordinary morning. Nowhere in the visible street was there any evidence that 3 hours from now, in a room on the 42nd floor of a building in the financial district, 12 men were going to decide the shape of everything. She drank the cold coffee. She needed to be ready. The family council convened at 10 in the morning. The room was on the 42nd floor of a building that nominally housed a private equity firm and actually housed, on its upper floors, the infrastructure of decisions that the city's visible power structures were built on top of. 12 families. 12 seats around a table that had been in this room for 26 years and had heard things that could not be said anywhere else. Celeste arrived with Gideon on her left and Victor Lane on her right. Damien walked beside her. Salvatore, moving carefully and with effort, walked behind them. The security at the door looked at Salvatore Moretti, alive, present, walking into the room, with an expression that required significant professional control to keep neutral. She noted it, filed it. Adrian was already inside. He was seated at the table with two advisors flanking him, and he was wearing a suit that had been pressed that morning, and he looked exactly like a man who believed he was walking into a situation he controlled. She watched his face when the door opened and he saw his father and his brother and Celeste all walk through it together. She watched him recalibrate. The recalibration took approximately 3 seconds. Then he composed himself, which told her he was good under pressure and had known this might not go perfectly. She had been counting on him being good under pressure. Less capable opponents were less satisfying to dismantle. Don Caruso, the eldest of the 12 in the de facto chair, indicated that both parties be seated. His face gave nothing. He was 81 years old and had heard everything and been surprised by very little for at least the last decade. Adrian spoke first. His presentation was smooth. She gave him that. He had clearly prepared and the preparation showed in the best possible way. It looked effortless. He walked through the financial documentation, the 14 months of transfers bearing Damien's authorization codes, the shell structure, the Viscari connection. He presented it as evidence of Damien's corruption, his endangerment of the Moretti name, his unfitness for continued leadership. He was persuasive. She watched the table's faces and saw the movement in some of them, the slight shifts that meant the argument was landing. She let him finish. Caruso looked at her. She stood. "What my brother-in-law has presented," she said, "is accurate in its details and false in its meaning. I'd like to show you why." She had organized the backup documentation into a sequence that built a single argument. The authorization timing was wrong. Not by much, the people who built it had been careful, but the specific pattern of when the transfers moved did not match Damien's operational calendar across 14 months. It matched a secondary pattern, Vivian's pattern. She walked them through it. Gideon handed documents as she needed them. Victor provided the contextual framework from his 19 years of adjacent observation. Adrian's advisors leaned toward him twice during this portion. She watched the leaning without letting it show that she was watching. Then she said, "I'd like to introduce a witness." The door opened. Vivian Cross walked in. She was composed in the way of someone who has made a decision and is committed to the cost of it. She was dressed simply, not the burgundy of the wedding, not any of the professional presentations Celeste had observed over 3 years. Just a woman in a gray suit who was going to say true things in a room full of men who didn't want to hear them. She sat in the chair at the end of the table that had been placed for exactly this purpose. She looked at Adrian once. He looked back. She looked away first, which was interesting, and then she began to speak. She spoke for 40 minutes. She described the recruitment, the firm in Bratislava, the approach, the briefing on the Moretti operation, and what Viscari needed from inside it. She described the 3 years of building the evidence package, the specific mechanics of how the transfers were structured to use Damien's credentials, while following a timing pattern he would never have noticed because she had control of the calendar that would have shown it to him. She described Adrian's role, not as a passive beneficiary, but as an active participant who had provided internal Moretti family information and had approved the tribunal strategy. She described Roman Viscari's endgame, the absorption plan, what the Moretti Empire would have become under Adrian's nominal leadership and Viscari's actual control. The room was very quiet by the time she finished. Then Salvatore Moretti stood up. It cost him something. She could see it in the way he pushed up from the chair, the slight catch in his breathing, the effort he absorbed without letting it show on his face. He stood, and he looked at the 11 men in the room who were not his son, and he said the things he had told her he would say. He said them clearly, without evasion, without the softening language that men of his generation used when confessing to things they had built and were not yet entirely sorry for. He described the parallel network, the 15 years of Viscari partnership, the money flows, the operational structure, the decision to bring Adrian in. He said these things looking at the table rather than at any face, which was its own kind of honesty. When he finished, he sat down. The effort of sitting was as visible as the effort of standing. Damien was looking at his hands. The room sat with what it had heard. Don Caruso spoke. "The documentation provided by Mrs. Moretti." He looked at Celeste. "You have the backing materials. Gideon Hale will provide the council with complete copies," she said, "including the decryption of the fabricated evidence package, which demonstrates the construction mechanism in detail." Caruso looked at Adrian. Adrian's face had gone through several things in the last 40 minutes and had settled on something that was not quite blankness, something more controlled than blankness. The expression of a man who is still calculating even when the calculation is very unlikely to land in his favor. "You have a response," Caruso said. Not warmly. Adrian looked at his advisors. One of them shook his head, minimally. "I have nothing to say to these accusations," Adrian said. It was the wrong choice. She had thought he might make it, the lawyer's instinct towards silence, and she had prepared for it being the wrong choice in exactly this room, where silence in the face of a witness's testimony and physical documentation carried a specific weight. Caruso looked down the table. The counsel conferred, not loudly, not in the manner of men who needed to argue, but in the careful murmuring of men who had sat in this room long enough to understand when a matter had been decided and needed to be formally concluded. It took 11 minutes. When Caruso spoke, he addressed the room rather than any specific person, which was the tradition. The tribunal found the evidence against Damian Moretti to be fabricated and without basis. The tribunal recognized the Moretti family succession documentation presented by Celeste Moretti as the governing authority on organizational leadership. Adrian Moretti's fitness for any role within the family structure would be reviewed by a separate proceeding. Contacts would be made with federal authorities regarding Roman Viscari's operation and the witness testimony provided today. She heard all of it from a place that felt slightly removed from the room, not dissociated, just very, very tired. The words arrived correctly, in the order she had needed them to arrive in, and she received them without visible reaction, because visible reaction was not something she was willing to produce in this room. Gideon put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She did not move. Adrian stood up when it was over. He looked at her across the table with the expression of a man assembling something to say that would mean something in this moment, and she watched him and waited. And what he said was, "Grandfather would have done the same thing." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "He would have." She turned away. The federal contact Celeste had reached, a woman named Pierce, who owed her grandfather a favor that had been in storage for 7 years, moved within 6 hours of the tribunal's conclusion. Roman Viscari was taken into custody at his Southside facility, where the drives stolen from Marco's warehouse were recovered, along with materials that, Pierce told her later in a phone call that lasted 4 minutes, would occupy a federal prosecution team for the better part of 3 years. Adrian was arrested the following morning. His advisors had already retained counsel and were cooperating with remarkable speed, which was its own kind of testimony to the quality of what they'd seen in that tribunal room. Vivian Cross entered federal witness protection 8 hours after her testimony. Celeste did not see her again. She thought sometimes about the woman in the hotel room with her arms crossed and her frightened eyes and her 2 phones, the woman who had spent 3 years building something meticulous and false, and who had, in the end, taken the door that led somewhere other than where Viscari had pointed. She did not know whether it had been courage or calculation. She suspected it had been both, in proportions only Vivian would ever know. Salvatore Moretti cooperated fully with both the family council review and the federal investigation. He did not contest the findings against him or the operational restructuring that followed. He spent the winter in the house he had owned for 40 years, not arrested, not exonerated, existing in the complicated middle space that very old men in complicated worlds sometimes occupied when they had outlived the structures they'd built. She visited him once, in January, when the snow was heavy and the city was quiet with it. She brought nothing and asked for nothing. She sat across from him in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and something her grandfather's kitchen had also smelled like, old wood and accumulated time, and they talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with empires or tribunals or 40 years of parallel maneuvering. He told her about a village in the south of Italy where he had grown up, where his mother had kept a garden. She told him about the summer she was 11, and her grandfather taught her to read a balance sheet by pretending it was a game. When she left, he stood at the door and watched her walk to her car. She turned once before getting in. He raised one hand. She raised hers back. She did not visit again, but she was glad she had gone. The restructuring took 7 months. It was the most sustained piece of work she had ever done, and she had done sustained work her entire adult life. She worked through it with Gideon at her side, with legal teams that she chose carefully and tested harder. with financial advisors and compliance officers, and eventually a board of directors that included 3 outside members with no connection to the world that had produced this situation. People who understood logistics, hospitality, private investment, and how to build organizations that were designed to last. The criminal operations were the first thing she dismantled, not because it was easy. It was not easy. It was 11 weeks of legal and operational complexity that required her full attention and produced a specific category of exhaustion she hadn't previously experienced. But because it was the thing that needed to happen first, before anything could be built on top of it. You couldn't construct something sound on a foundation that was still on fire. The Moretti name stayed. She had considered whether it should, had turned it over carefully, from multiple angles, the way she turned over everything, and had concluded that the name itself was not the problem. Names were structures, and structures could be rebuilt to contain different things. The Moretti organization became, over 7 months, a holding company with subsidiaries in international logistics, luxury hospitality, private investment management, and a foundation that her grandfather had started and she decided to finish. The foundation was the last thing. She saved it for last deliberately. It was the piece she had been least certain how to build, because her grandfather had left only the beginning of it, and she had to construct the rest from her own understanding of what he had wanted. She built it in his name. She put Gideon on the board. She endowed its first 3 programs from her own holdings. When she signed the foundation documents, sitting at the desk in the office that was now hers, the top floor of the building her grandfather had owned and she had always assumed she would one day inherit, although never quite like this. She sat for a long time afterward without moving. Gideon came in at some point with 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her, and they drank them without talking, which was one of the things she valued most about 61 years of hard-earned Gideon. The knowledge of when silence was the right thing. He would have had notes, she said eventually. He would have had extensive notes, Gideon agreed, probably written in that shorthand. And he would have been right about half of them. 60%, Gideon said. He was usually right about 60%. She almost smiled. The other 40? The other 40 he would have blamed on market conditions and pretended he'd anticipated them. She did smile then. Not large, not performed, just the small real thing that lived underneath the composed face when something was genuinely funny. That's accurate. Gideon looked at her over his coffee cup. How are you, Celeste? She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. Not performing consideration, actually sitting with it, the way she had not had time to sit with anything for 7 months. I'm tired, she said. In a way I haven't been before. Not the kind that sleep fixes. No, he said. That kind takes longer. How long? He thought about it. Your grandfather went through something similar in 1994. I was there for it. He looked at his cup. He took 6 weeks and went to the coast and read books he'd been meaning to read and didn't speak to anyone in the organization except me, once a week, for exactly 20 minutes. He paused. Then he came back and built the next 20 years. She looked at her desk, at the signed foundation documents, at the window behind them that showed the city in the late afternoon of a November that had come in cold and clear, the kind of day that made the city look like a thing worth preserving. The coast, she said. The coast, he said. She saw Damien twice in the 7 months. The first time was in the 2nd week, when the legal structure of the separation was being finalized, and they sat across from their respective attorneys in a conference room that was neutral territory and worked through the practical architecture of undoing a marriage that had lasted, technically, 4 days. She had not wanted to make it harder than it needed to be. He had not wanted to make it harder either. They had both wanted it to be over, and the wanting of that same thing in the same way was perhaps the most honest alignment they had ever had. When the meeting was over and the attorneys had gone, they stood in the corridor outside the conference room for a moment. He looked like he had been sleeping, which was more than she had been doing. He looked like a man rebuilding something from the ground floor. Slowly, without the old framework, without the assumptions that had made the first version of the building unsound. I'm leaving Chicago, he said. She looked at him. For a while, he said. Maybe longer. I don't know yet. He turned his hat in his hands, an old hat, one she recognized, one he'd had since before she'd known him. I'm going to figure out what I actually want, separate from what I was supposed to want. She thought that was probably the most honest thing he had ever said to her. Good, she said. He looked at her. Are you... He stopped, started differently. Is there anything you need from me before I go? She considered the question properly. Not the lawyer's version of the question, not the strategic version, the human version. No, she said. I have what I need. He nodded. He put the hat on. He looked at her one more time with the specific look of a man who has arrived at the end of something and is trying to find the correct expression for it. And she looked back and let him look. And then he said, take care of it. The name, what it could be. I will, she said. He walked down the corridor. She watched him go. He didn't look back, which was right. She stood there for a moment after he turned the corner. Then she walked the other direction. The second time was accidental. A restaurant, 6 months later, on opposite sides of the room. He was with someone she didn't recognize. He looked easy. Lighter, maybe, in the specific way of someone who has set a thing down that they were carrying too long. He caught her eye across the room once. He raised his glass, minimally. She raised hers back. They both looked away. That was sufficient. That was, she thought, the correct ending to that particular story. Not dramatic, not cold, just two people who had been through something together arriving, separately, at the ordinary human conclusion of it. She drank her wine and thought about what else she was doing that week, and that was enough. She went to the coast in December, a house she had rented, small, on a stretch of shoreline that was too cold in winter for anyone who didn't specifically want the emptiness of it. She brought 6 books. She brought the leather notebook from Victor, which she had not finished reading. She brought the photograph of her grandfather and Salvatore Moretti, the one with the laughter and the restaurant and the backs of the 2 men who thought they were controlling things. She pinned it to the wall of the small bedroom. She looked at it every morning when she woke up. She thought about control, about the specific human need to believe that you are the architect of things, that the structure you are building is the one that will stand, that the moves you are making are the ones that determine what comes next. She had been raised inside that belief. She had structured her entire adult life around it. She had walked into the worst week of her life believing she was prepared, and she had been wrong. Not entirely, not fatally, but wrong enough that the preparation had not looked like what she'd expected. And yet, she had walked through it. Not because she had been more prepared than she thought, but because she had been able to change when the preparation stopped being adequate, because she had been willing to look at the real picture when it was different from the one she'd built, because she had been able to take what she had, incomplete, imperfect, partial, and stand up in front of 12 men and make the argument with what was in her hands instead of waiting for the argument she'd planned to make. Her grandfather had not left her a perfect plan. He had left her the capacity to make the plan she needed. She thought that was probably the more valuable gift. She read on the cold mornings and walked on the beach in the afternoons, which was not a beautiful beach in December. It was gray and wind-scraped and the waves were heavy, and it smelled like cold salt and the specific earthiness of things that had been underwater. And she walked it anyway because the difficulty of it was not a problem. The difficulty of it was the point. She had spent enough time in controlled environments. She could tolerate a difficult beach. On the 15th day, she called Gideon. 20 minutes, she said. Go ahead, he said. She told him 3 things she wanted to do with the foundation in the spring. He told her 2 things the board was asking about that she needed to weigh in on. They agreed on a direction for each of them. Then she said, thank you. And he said, see you in January, and she hung up. She sat with the phone in her lap and the sound of the water outside. She thought about her grandfather deadheading roses and knowing what was coming and doing it anyway. The specific quality of that. The decision to tend things carefully, even when you knew the time was limited, maybe because the time was limited, because the tending was the part that was within your reach, even when everything else was not. She got up and made coffee and brought it to the window. The water was gray and heavy and going about its business with the total indifference of something that did not need to be observed to continue. She had always liked that about large bodies of water. The complete irrelevance of your presence. The continuation that had nothing to do with you and would have nothing to do with you long after you were done. She pressed 2 fingers under her jaw. Her pulse was steady. It was finally just steady. Not working hard against something, not pressing back against anything, just running at the rate of a person who has been through a thing and is, at the moment, standing still and drinking coffee in a cold house by the water and not yet deciding what comes next. She had built the empire. She had defended it. She had dismantled the parts of it that needed to be dismantled, and she had begun the work of building what came after. She had not needed the throne. She had only ever needed to understand what it was actually made of. Not the gold surface of it, but the thing underneath, the structure, the foundation, the accumulated decisions of people who had made their choices in the rooms before she arrived. She understood it now. She would build the next part differently. Not without mistakes. She had stopped believing, somewhere in the middle of the worst week of her life, that the goal was to make no mistakes. The goal was to be the kind of person who could look at the mistake clearly and change direction and keep going, because that was the only thing that actually separated the people who built something lasting from the people who built something that collapsed when the first unexpected weight came down on it. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup. She sat back down at the table with the leather notebook and turned to the last section she hadn't finished reading, the final pages of her grandfather's handwriting, the entries from the months when he had known the clock was running. He had not written anything desperate in those pages. Nothing dramatic, nothing about what he was afraid of or what he wished had gone differently. He had written, in his precise and specific shorthand, a list of things he had not yet done and would not have time to do, and beside each item, a note about who might do it after him. Most of the notes said her name. She sat with that for a long time. Outside the window, the water kept going. The light was changing toward late afternoon. That specific winter coastal light that was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but had its own quality, its own particular honesty, the way things look when they are only what they are. She closed the notebook. She put it down on the table. She looked at the window and the water and the gray, honest light. She was 34 years old. She was the architect of what came next. She had been built for it by a man who had not had enough time, and she had defended it against people who had not understood what they were trying to take. And she had done it imperfectly, and with her hands shaking at certain moments, and her pulse hard when she needed it to be soft, and her plans wrong in ways that required everything she had to correct. And she was here. She was still here. That, she thought, would have to be enough to begin with. She got up and put her coat on, and went outside to walk the cold and difficult beach, while there was still light enough to see by. And she walked until her legs were tired and her face was windburned, and the city, and the tribunal, and the drives, and the warehouse, and all of it was behind her at a distance that felt, for the first time, like something she was choosing rather than something she was running from. Then she turned around and walked back to the house, and she made dinner, and she read, and she slept. And in the morning, she began.